Hello everyone, I'm the Midnight Truth, here to keep you company tonight. I know many of you use these stories to fall asleep, so before we begin, make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time is it there? Let's get started. Story 1. Sarah tightened her grip on the steering wheel, her knuckles pale in the dim light of the dying sun. The narrow road stretched ahead like a black ribbon cutting through the dense Maine woods. Trees towered on either side, their skeletal branches clawing at the twilight sky. The storm had been threatening all day, a distant rumble of thunder rolling through the air every so often, but the rain had yet to fall. Her GPS had betrayed her an hour ago, freezing and then dying completely. No signal, the screen mocked, and Sarah had cursed under her breath, tossing the useless device into the passenger seat. Now, with no clear sense of direction, she relied on intuition and the faint hope that this winding road would lead her to civilization. But it didn't. Instead, the road narrowed further, the trees pressing in as if trying to force her car off the path. The wind picked up, carrying with it a sound that could have been whispers, or just the rustle of leaves. She glanced in her rearview mirror, though she wasn't sure why. The road behind her was as empty as it had been all day, and yet a strange sensation tugged at her, a sense that she wasn't alone. Then she saw it. The mansion loomed out of the shadows like a ghostly specter, its dark outline rising against the purple-gray sky. It sat at the end of a narrow gravel driveway, partially hidden by a curtain of ivy and overgrown trees. Victorian in style, it was the kind of house that might have been grand once, but now it seemed forgotten by time. The peaked roof was missing shingles, and several of the tall windows were cracked or boarded up. Sarah hesitated, her foot hovering over the brake. Every rational part of her screamed to keep driving, but something about the house drew her in, a pull she couldn't explain. She wasn't one to spook easily, but this place exuded an air of abandonment that was almost deliberate, as if it had been waiting for her. She parked at the edge of the driveway, the gravel crunching under her tires, and grabbed her camera from the passenger seat. "This is why you came out here," she muttered to herself, trying to ignore the unease creeping up her spine. "Old places, forgotten places. You've done this 100 times before." But as she stepped out of the car and approached the house, her boots sinking into the damp earth, she couldn't shake the feeling that this time was different. The wooden steps groaned under her weight as she climbed to the front door. Up close, the mansion was even more imposing. The windows were streaked with grime, and the door itself was heavy oak, its surface scarred with deep scratches as though some wild animal had tried to claw its way inside. She raised her hand to knock, out of habit more than necessity, but before her fist could make contact, the door creaked open on its own. Sarah froze. The air that seeped out was cold, carrying with it the smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic. She glanced back at her car, its headlights cutting through the encroaching darkness, and considered leaving. But curiosity won out. It always did. Pushing the door open further, she stepped inside. The foyer was massive, with high ceilings and a sweeping staircase that curved up into shadows. A chandelier hung above her, its crystals dull with dust, and the patterned wallpaper was peeling at the edges. Furniture draped in white sheets lined the walls, giving the space the look of a funeral parlor. Her footsteps echoed on the hardwood floor as she moved deeper into the house. It was colder inside than it had been outside, and she pulled her jacket tighter around herself. Everything felt wrong. It wasn't just the silence, though that was unnerving enough. It was the way the house seemed to breathe, the way the shadows shifted in the corners of her vision. And then there were the footprints, small, childlike prints in the thick layer of dust that covered the floor. She followed them without thinking, her camera clicking softly as she snapped photos of the eerie scene. The trail led her to a narrow hallway and then to a door at the end. It was slightly ajar, and from within came a faint sound. Whispers. Her heart thudded in her chest as she approached, each step slower than the last. She couldn't make out the words, but the tone was low and urgent, like someone pleading. With a trembling hand, she pushed the door open. The room was empty. It was small, more like a storage closet than anything else, with shelves lining the walls and a single bulb dangling from the ceiling. Dust motes danced in the weak light, and the air was heavy with the scent of mildew. But there was no one there. No one, except for her reflection. In the far corner of the room stood a full-length mirror, its ornate frame tarnished with age. Sarah's reflection stared back at her, but something about it was off. Her movements were perfectly mirrored, yet her reflection's eyes seemed darker, deeper. She stepped closer, her breath fogging the glass. For a moment, she thought she saw something move behind her in the reflection, a shadow flitting across the doorway. Spinning around, she found nothing but the empty hallway. When she turned back to the mirror, the reflection was normal. Sarah left the room quickly, her pulse racing. She told herself it was just her imagination, but the words felt hollow. She returned to the foyer, intent on leaving, but something caught her eye, a light. It was faint, barely more than a flicker, but it came from upstairs. Her instincts screamed at her to get out, to run to her car and never look back. But instead, she found herself climbing the staircase, her camera held tightly in one hand. The second floor was darker, the air heavier. She followed the light to a room at the end of the hallway. The door was slightly open, just like the one downstairs, and she could see the glow of a lamp spilling out. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside. The room was a study with bookshelves lining the walls and a desk in the center. The lamp on the desk was old-fashioned, with a green glass shade, and it cast an eerie glow over the room. Papers were scattered across the desk, yellowed with age and covered in spidery handwriting. But what drew her attention was the chair behind the desk. It was facing away from her, but she could see the edge of a figure, a shoulder, an arm. "Hello," she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The chair creaked as it began to turn. The chair creaked slowly, its movement deliberate, each sound dragging against Sarah's nerves like nails on a chalkboard. Her pulse thundered in her ears as she watched it pivot toward her, revealing the figure sitting in it. Except, there was no one there. The chair came to a stop, facing her, but it was empty. Sarah let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, her muscles loosening for the briefest moment before tension gripped her again. Something about the room felt wrong, as though it were holding its breath alongside her. The lamp's light flickered, casting dancing shadows on the walls. She took a cautious step forward, her boots scraping against the wooden floor. The papers scattered across the desk fluttered slightly as if caught in a draft, though the air was oppressively still. Her camera hung from its strap around her neck, and she lifted it instinctively, snapping a picture of the room. The flash illuminated the space for a split second, but in that brief burst of light, she thought she saw something, a dark figure standing just behind her. She spun around, heart pounding, but the doorway was empty. "Get a grip," she muttered under her breath, lowering the camera. But her voice sounded hollow in the oppressive quiet, as if the house itself were mocking her. The study's strange stillness seemed to press in on her as she stepped closer to the desk. The papers were old and yellowed, covered in handwriting so spidery it was almost unreadable. She squinted, trying to make sense of the words. "The house refuses, the time is near." The fragmented phrases sent a chill crawling up her spine. It was as though someone had written them in haste, their hand trembling with fear. She reached for one of the papers, but the moment her fingers brushed it, the lamp flickered violently and then went out, plunging the room into darkness. Sarah froze. The faint sound of breathing reached her ears, not her own. It was coming from the corner of the room, low and ragged, like something struggling to draw air. Her mind screamed at her to run, but her legs felt rooted to the spot. Slowly, she turned her head toward the source of the sound. The shadows in the corner seemed to deepen, twisting and shifting, forming a shape that wasn't there before. A whisper broke the silence, soft but distinct. "Leave." The word was drawn out, a guttural rasp that sent a shiver down her spine. Sarah stumbled back, her hand knocking into the desk. The lamp flickered back to life for a split second, and in that moment she saw it, an emaciated figure crouched in the corner, its face obscured by a tangle of black hair, its skeletal hands reaching out toward her. She bolted from the room, her breaths coming in gasps as she fled down the hallway. The house seemed to come alive around her, the floorboards groaning and the walls creaking as though it were waking from a long slumber. The stairs loomed ahead, but as Sarah reached the top step, a loud crash echoed from the study. It sounded as though the desk had been overturned, followed by the scraping of furniture being dragged across the floor. She didn't stop to look back. Her boots pounded against the stairs as she descended, the banister trembling under her grip. The chandelier in the foyer swayed violently, its crystals clinking together like a wind chime in a storm. She reached the bottom step and sprinted toward the front door, her camera bouncing against her chest. But when she grabbed the handle and twisted, the door wouldn't budge. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. She yanked on the handle with all her strength, but it held fast, as though something on the other side was keeping it closed. A low, guttural sound rose from behind her, a growl that didn't sound remotely human. She turned slowly, her back pressed against the door. The shadows in the foyer seemed to ripple, coalescing into a shape that towered over her. It had no discernible features, just a mass of darkness that pulsed and writhed like a living thing. The growl deepened, and Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She fumbled for the camera around her neck, lifting it with trembling hands. The flash went off, illuminating the creature for the briefest moment. It was humanoid, but its limbs were unnaturally long and twisted, its face a blank canvas of pale skin with no eyes or mouth. The light seemed to disorient it, and it recoiled slightly, giving Sarah just enough time to act. She bolted toward the nearest door, which led to a side hallway. The house groaned around her, the sound reverberating through the walls like a warning. The hallway was narrow and lined with closed doors, each one identical and unmarked. She tried the first door on her left, but it was locked. The second door was the same. The third door creaked open, revealing a small sitting room filled with antique furniture and a large fireplace. Sarah rushed inside and slammed the door behind her, locking it with the rusted bolt. Her chest heaved as she pressed her back against the door, listening for any sign of the creature. The house had gone eerily quiet again, but she knew better than to trust the silence. Her eyes darted around the room, searching for anything she could use to defend herself. The fireplace poker caught her attention, a long iron rod with a sharp tip. She grabbed it, the weight of it reassuring in her hands. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. The only sound was the crackling of the fire in the hearth, which she hadn't noticed before. She stared at it, her mind racing. Who had lit it? The flames danced in a strange, almost hypnotic pattern, casting flickering shadows on the walls. And then she saw it, etched into the brick above the fireplace. A symbol. It was circular, with jagged lines radiating outward like the spokes of a wheel. At the center was an eye, unblinking and eerily lifelike. As she stared at it, the flames seemed to dim and the room grew colder. The symbol seemed to glow faintly as though it were alive. A whisper filled the room, soft and insistent. Sarah? Her name. Her blood turned to ice. The whisper came again, louder this time. Sarah, you shouldn't have come here. She stumbled back, clutching the poker like a lifeline. The symbol on the fireplace flared brightly, and the flames roared to life, the heat searing her skin. And then the door behind her rattled violently, as though something were trying to force its way inside. The door rattled violently behind Sarah, the sharp sound cutting through the room like a blade. Each jolt sent splinters flying from the aged wood, the bolt barely holding against the relentless assault. She clutched the fireplace poker, her knuckles white, her breath shallow and ragged. Her mind screamed for an escape route, but the room offered none. The only other way out was a small window, its panes streaked with grime and warped by time. She darted toward it, yanking at the latch, but the window wouldn't budge. The rattling stopped. Sarah froze, her chest heaving. The sudden silence was almost worse than the chaos. She pressed her ear to the door, listening. Nothing. Just the crackle of the fire behind her. Her shoulders sagged in tentative relief, until she heard the whisper again. Sarah? It wasn't coming from the door. This time it was inside the room. She spun around, her eyes scanning the shadows. The firelight danced across the walls, casting flickering shapes that seemed to shift and writhe with unnatural fluidity. The whisper came again, low and insistent, but it wasn't a single voice anymore. It was many, overlapping and echoing as though the walls themselves were speaking. The voices grew louder, their words fragmented and nonsensical. Leave, she waits, you can't. Sarah backed away from the fireplace, her pulse hammering in her ears. Her foot hit something solid and she stumbled, nearly falling. When she looked down, she saw an old leather-bound book lying on the floor. It hadn't been there before. The cover was cracked and worn, the edges of the pages yellowed with age. A strange symbol was embossed on the front, a circular pattern with jagged lines, eerily similar to the one above the fireplace. Her hands trembled as she picked it up. The book was heavier than it looked, and its leather surface was oddly warm as though it were alive. She hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to leave it alone. But curiosity, or perhaps something deeper, compelled her to open it. The pages were filled with handwritten text, the ink faded and smudged in places. The writing was jagged and erratic, as though the author had scrawled it in desperation. The house, it feeds, it knows. The walls whisper truths we aren't meant to hear. The words sent a chill down her spine. As she flipped through the pages, the whispers around her grew louder, more frantic. Stop, one voice hissed. Don't read it, another warned. But Sarah couldn't stop. The book seemed to draw her in, each word pulling her deeper into its dark revelations. One passage caught her eye, written in larger, bolder letters than the rest. The house binds itself to those who enter. It learns their fears, their regrets. It uses them. You cannot escape once it knows you. Her breath hitched. The words felt like a warning and a threat. As she stared at the page, the ink began to shift, the letters rearranging themselves before her eyes. New words appeared, spelling out a message that made her blood run cold. "Sarah, it's too late." She dropped the book, stumbling back toward the door. Her mind raced. How did it know her name? How could any of this be real? The voices in the walls grew louder, a cacophony of anguish and rage. The fire in the hearth flared violently, the flames turning an unnatural shade of green. The air grew thick with the stench of burning wood and something else, something metallic like blood. And then she saw it. The walls began to ripple, the plaster bulging and cracking as though something were trying to push through. Dark, oozing stains spread across the surface, forming grotesque shapes. Faces distorted and screaming in silent agony. The whispers became screams. "Get out!" The bolt on the door snapped with a deafening crack, the door flying open with such force that it slammed against the wall. Sarah didn't hesitate. She bolted into the hallway, the book forgotten on the floor behind her. The house was alive now, its walls groaning and creaking, the very air vibrating with malice. The narrow hallway seemed to stretch endlessly before her, the doors on either side rattling violently as she passed. Her footsteps echoed unnaturally, the sound warped and distorted. She glanced over her shoulder, half expecting to see the dark figure from the study chasing her. But the hallway was empty, save for the shadows that seemed to reach for her as she ran. A sudden crash ahead made her skid to a stop. One of the doors had been flung open, its frame splintered and sagging on its hinges. The room beyond was pitch black, an impenetrable void that seemed to pulse with malevolence. Sarah took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to turn around. But the hallway behind her was closing in, the walls inching closer together, the air growing suffocatingly thick. She had no choice. Clutching the poker tightly, she stepped into the room. The darkness swallowed her immediately, the faint light from the hallway snuffed out the moment she crossed the threshold. Her breathing sounded loud in the oppressive silence, each inhale and exhale echoing as though the room were vast and empty. "Hello," she called out, her voice trembling. The response came almost instantly, a low, guttural laugh that sent shivers racing down her spine. She raised the poker defensively, her eyes straining to see anything in the inky blackness. Slowly, her vision adjusted, and she realized she wasn't alone. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with jars. Hundreds of them. Some were cracked and empty, while others contained things she couldn't identify, dark, viscous liquids, strange shapes suspended in fluid, and what looked disturbingly like human teeth. And then, in the far corner of the room, she saw it. A figure stood motionless, its back to her. It was tall and unnaturally thin, its limbs elongated and grotesquely bent. Its head tilted at an unnatural angle, as though it were listening to something she couldn't hear. Sarah's grip tightened on the poker, her heart pounding so hard it felt like it would burst from her chest. She took a cautious step back, but the floor creaked loudly beneath her. The figure's head snapped around, and Sarah barely stifled a scream. Its face was a twisted mockery of humanity, no eyes, no nose, just a gaping mouth filled with jagged, broken teeth. It moved toward her with a jerky, unnatural gait, its limbs contorting as though it were learning how to walk. Sarah swung the poker wildly, the sharp tip grazing the figure's arm. It let out a guttural screech, the sound piercing and inhuman, and recoiled. Seizing the opportunity, she bolted for the door. The darkness seemed to cling to her, slowing her down, but she pushed through it, her desperation overpowering her fear. She stumbled back into the hallway, slamming the door shut behind her. The house groaned in protest, the walls trembling as though it were enraged. Her chest heaved as she leaned against the door, her mind racing. She couldn't stay here. She had to find a way out, now. But as she looked down the hallway, she realized it had changed. The doors were gone, replaced by smooth, unbroken walls. The only way forward was a spiral staircase at the end of the hall, descending into darkness. The whispers returned, soft and insistent. "Downstairs, Sarah, it's waiting for you." The spiral staircase loomed ahead, its metal frame rusted and pitted with age. The steps were narrow, spiraling down into a void that seemed to swallow all light. Sarah hesitated, clutching the fireplace poker like a lifeline. Her breath came in shallow gasps, the sound of it echoing faintly down the hall. Behind her, the walls quivered, the faint whispering growing louder. The voices weren't just calling her now, they were urging her forward, an insistent chorus that made her skin crawl. "You can't stop now," one voice said. "It's the only way out," another chimed. But was it? Sarah's instincts screamed otherwise, warning her that going down those stairs was a mistake she couldn't take back. She cast a desperate glance over her shoulder, hoping for another escape route. The hallway behind her was gone. In its place stood a solid wall, its surface rippling like water. Dark stains spread across it, forming grotesque shapes. Faces, limbs, twisted bodies trapped beneath the surface. There was no turning back. Sarah placed one foot on the first step, and it let out a low, metallic groan. The sound echoed down the staircase, disappearing into the endless black below. With each step, the air grew colder, the damp chill seeping into her skin. The whispers followed her, growing fainter but never completely fading. They seemed to merge with the sound of her footsteps, creating an eerie rhythm that kept her nerves on edge. The staircase spiraled endlessly, each turn revealing only more darkness. Sarah began to lose track of time, her sense of direction slipping away. Up and down felt the same now, the oppressive atmosphere disorienting her. She paused, gripping the railing to steady herself. The metal was icy under her fingers, and when she pulled her hand away, it came back slick with something dark and viscous. "God," she whispered, wiping her hand on her jeans. And then she heard it, a faint, wet squelching sound coming from below. Her stomach tightened as the sound grew louder, accompanied by a low, guttural growl. She froze, straining her ears to pinpoint its location. Something was moving in the darkness below, its heavy, uneven footsteps echoing up the staircase. Sarah's heart pounded as she backed up a step, her grip tightening on the poker. The growl deepened, a sound so primal and guttural it seemed to vibrate through the very air around her. She couldn't see it yet, but she could feel it, something massive, something wrong, ascending the stairs. A voice in her head whispered, "Run." Sarah turned and bolted up the staircase, her feet barely touching the steps. The growling behind her turned into a deafening roar, the sound reverberating through the metal frame of the stairs. The air grew heavier, each breath feeling like she was inhaling ash. Her vision blurred, the staircase tilting beneath her like a ship caught in a storm. And then the staircase ended. She stumbled into a cavernous space, the sudden change in terrain nearly sending her sprawling. The floor was cold stone, slick with moisture. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the walls glistened as though they were sweating. The room was massive, the ceiling lost in shadows. Flickering light from an unknown source illuminated the space just enough for her to see the outlines of strange, jagged structures scattered across the floor. Sarah's breathing slowed as she took a cautious step forward. The structures were altars, crude and ancient, carved from stone and covered in strange, unholy symbols. Each one was surrounded by what looked like offerings: shattered bones, rusted chains, and jars filled with dark, unidentifiable substances. At the center of the room stood a towering stone pillar, its surface covered in the same jagged symbols. Unlike the others, this pillar seemed to hum with energy, a faint, pulsating glow emanating from deep within its cracks. Sarah felt drawn to it, an inexplicable pull that made her legs move even as her mind screamed at her to stop. She approached the pillar cautiously, her eyes scanning its surface. The symbols seemed to shift and writhe, their edges blurring as though they were alive. As she reached out to touch it, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Closer," they urged. "See what lies beneath." Her fingers brushed the surface, and the room erupted in light. Images flashed before her eyes, scenes of horror and pain. She saw the house as it had once been, filled with life and laughter. But that laughter turned to screams as shadows crept through the halls, consuming everything in their path. She saw people, dozens of them, bound and terrified, their faces twisted in agony as they were dragged to the altars. And she saw the figure from the room above, its grotesque form looming over them, feeding on their fear. The images shifted, showing her things she didn't want to see, visions of her own life, her own fears. Memories she had buried deep began to surface, each one more painful than the last. Sarah ripped her hand away, gasping for air. The pillar's glow faded, but the symbols continued to pulse faintly, as though mocking her. "Why are you showing me this?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The response came not in words but in a feeling, a cold, suffocating pressure that wrapped around her chest, squeezing the air from her lungs. She staggered back, her vision swimming. The room seemed to shift around her, the walls closing in, the altars melting into grotesque shapes. And then she saw it. The creature had followed her. It emerged from the staircase, its massive form crouched low to fit through the doorway. Its limbs were long and spindly, its skin a sickly gray that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. Its eyeless face turned toward her, the gaping mouth splitting open in a horrifying grin. Sarah stumbled backward, her hands fumbling for the poker. The creature moved slowly, its gait uneven and jerky. It seemed to savor her fear, its head tilting as though listening to her rapid heartbeat. She swung the poker as it lunged, the metal connecting with a sickening crunch. The creature screeched, recoiling, but the sound only seemed to enrage it. It charged at her, its claws raking the air. Sarah ducked, rolling to the side as its massive hands slammed into the pillar. The room shook violently, dust and debris raining down from the ceiling. The creature roared in frustration, turning its eyeless gaze back to her. This was it. She couldn't run anymore. She gripped the poker tightly, her fear replaced by a surge of desperate determination. The creature lunged again, but this time, Sarah was ready. She ducked under its swing and drove the sharp end of the poker into its chest. The creature let out a deafening shriek, its body convulsing as black ichor poured from the wound. The symbols on the pillar flared to life, their glow blindingly bright. The creature staggered, its movements growing sluggish. Sarah yanked the poker free and struck again, her rage fueling her strikes. With one final ear-splitting roar, the creature collapsed, its body disintegrating into a pool of dark, viscous liquid. The room fell silent. Sarah dropped the poker, her body trembling with exhaustion. She looked around, expecting something, anything, to happen. But the room remained still, the oppressive atmosphere lifting ever so slightly. For the first time since entering the house, she felt a glimmer of hope. But as she turned toward the staircase, she realized the whispers hadn't stopped. They were louder now, more insistent, and they weren't coming from the walls. They were coming from inside her own mind. The staircase was gone. Sarah stared in disbelief at the solid wall where the staircase had been just moments ago. The cold stone seemed to pulse faintly, as if mocking her attempts to escape. She turned back to the cavernous room, her trembling hands clutching the blood-streaked poker. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were louder now, overlapping and disjointed, no longer coming from a single direction. They filled her mind like a storm, making it hard to think. "Find it," one voice hissed. "Finish what you started," another demanded. Her breath hitched as the realization settled in, this wasn't over. The room seemed smaller now, its vastness replaced by a suffocating closeness. The walls pulsed faintly, their surfaces rippling like liquid stone. The altars were still there, but their symbols glowed faintly now, casting eerie shadows that danced across the floor. Sarah forced herself to move, her legs heavy as if weighed down by invisible chains. She walked toward the nearest wall, running her fingers over its rough, damp surface. It was cold, colder than anything she had ever felt, and it sent a sharp ache through her fingertips. "Where do I go?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The air around her seemed to shift, the whispers growing quieter for a moment, as if considering her question. Then, with a low rumble, the floor beneath her began to move. The stone tiles rearranged themselves, sliding and grinding against each other with an ear-splitting screech. Sarah stumbled backward, nearly losing her balance as the room reshaped itself before her eyes. When the rumbling stopped, she was no longer in the cavern. She stood at the entrance of a long, narrow corridor. The walls were smooth and featureless, their surfaces unnaturally clean. A faint light emanated from the floor, just enough to see a few feet ahead. The whispers resumed, softer now but more insidious. They seemed to come from the corridor itself, beckoning her forward. "Keep going," they urged. "You don't have a choice." Sarah glanced over her shoulder, hoping for some sign of the cavern, but it was gone. The corridor stretched endlessly in both directions, offering no alternative. With no other option, she gripped the poker tighter and began to walk. The corridor was eerily quiet, the only sound the faint scuff of her footsteps against the stone floor. The air was stale and heavy, each breath feeling like a struggle. As she moved deeper, she noticed strange patterns etched into the walls, geometric shapes that seemed to shift and twist when she looked directly at them. The symbols were unlike anything she had ever seen, and yet they felt disturbingly familiar. Her pace quickened as unease settled over her. The corridor seemed to stretch endlessly, each step taking her farther from the world she knew. Then, without warning, the light beneath her feet flickered and went out. She froze, her heart pounding in the sudden darkness. The whispers grew louder, surrounding her in a cacophony of voices that overlapped and echoed. "Run. Turn back. Keep going." She didn't know which voice to trust, if any. Her hands shook as she fumbled for the wall, using it to guide her forward. The darkness was absolute, pressing in on her like a physical weight. And then she heard it, a faint tapping sound like fingernails against stone. The sound was rhythmic, deliberate, and it was getting closer. Panic set in as the tapping grew louder, accompanied by a faint, raspy breathing. Sarah pressed herself against the wall, trying to make herself as small as possible. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by an eerie silence. She held her breath, straining her ears for any sign of movement. Suddenly, a cold, bony hand brushed against her arm. She screamed, swinging the poker wildly. The metal struck something solid, eliciting a guttural snarl. A pair of glowing red eyes appeared in the darkness, locking onto her. The creature lunged, its sharp claws slashing through the air. Sarah ducked and ran, her footsteps echoing as she sprinted blindly down the corridor. The corridor twisted and turned, each corner leading to another identical stretch of darkness. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. The creature's snarls echoed behind her, growing fainter with each step. She turned a corner and skidded to a halt, nearly colliding with a massive, ornate door. The door was unlike anything else in the corridor, its surface covered in intricate carvings that glowed faintly in the darkness. Strange symbols surrounded a central emblem, a handprint etched into the stone. Without thinking, Sarah pressed her hand against the emblem. The door shuddered, the carvings flaring brightly before the heavy stone began to slide open. She stepped through the doorway and into a new space. The air was colder here, and the faint light from the carvings illuminated a circular room with high, arched ceilings. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with jars, books, and strange artifacts. At the center of the room stood a pedestal, its surface bare except for a single object, a small, black box. The whispers grew louder, their tone shifting to something almost reverent. "Take it," they urged. Sarah approached the pedestal cautiously, her eyes locked on the box. It was unremarkable at first glance, its surface smooth and featureless. But as she drew closer, she felt a strange energy emanating from it, a pulsing, rhythmic vibration that seemed to sync with her heartbeat. Her hand hovered over the box, hesitating. Every instinct told her not to touch it, that whatever was inside was better left alone. But the whispers were relentless now, urging her on. "It's the key," they said. "The only way to end this." With a deep breath, Sarah reached out and lifted the box. The room erupted in light, blinding her. She stumbled back, clutching the box to her chest as the air around her seemed to crackle with energy. When the light faded, the room was no longer empty. Figures stood around her, their forms translucent and flickering like old film reels. They wore expressions of anguish and despair, their eyes hollow and lifeless. One figure stepped forward, a man dressed in tattered, blood-stained clothes. He raised a hand, pointing directly at the box. "You don't understand what you've done," he said, his voice echoing as though coming from a great distance. "What is this?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The man's expression darkened. "It's not what it seems. It's a prison, a cage for something that should never be released." The whispers in her mind turned to screams, drowning out his words. The figures began to fade, their forms dissolving into mist. The man's voice lingered, a final warning echoing in her ears. "Leave this place. Destroy it before it's too late." The room began to shake, the walls cracking and crumbling. Sarah clutched the box tightly, her mind racing. She didn't know what to believe. Was the man telling the truth, or was this another trick? The floor beneath her gave way, and she plunged into darkness once more. Sarah awoke to the sensation of falling, though her body was still. Her mind clung to the last fragments of the man's warning, his voice echoing faintly in the void. When her eyes adjusted, she realized she wasn't in complete darkness. A faint, sickly green glow illuminated the space around her. She lay on a hard, uneven surface, the edges of jagged stones pressing into her back. Slowly she sat up, her breath catching at the sight before her. She was in a massive cavern, larger than any space she had ever seen. The walls were lined with pulsing veins of glowing green light, casting eerie shadows that seemed to shift and writhe. The air was thick and humid, carrying a metallic tang that made her stomach churn. In the center of the cavern was a massive pit, its edges lined with jagged stones. A low, guttural hum emanated from within, vibrating through her bones. She glanced down at her hands and saw the box, still clutched tightly against her chest. Its surface was warm now, as if alive, and it pulsed faintly in time with the hum. "Where am I?" she whispered, her voice swallowed by the cavern's oppressive atmosphere. The whispers returned, faint but insistent. Deeper, they urged. "Finish it." She stood, her legs unsteady, and looked around for any sign of an exit. The cavern walls seemed endless, curving upward into darkness. The only way forward was toward the pit. Her instincts screamed at her to turn back, to find another way out, but the whispers wouldn't let her. They grew louder with each step she took toward the pit, their tone shifting from urgency to something almost ecstatic. As she neared the edge, the hum grew louder, resonating through her chest. She peered over the edge, her breath catching at what she saw. The pit wasn't empty. A swirling mass of darkness writhed within, its surface alive with movement. Shapes emerged and disappeared, their forms impossible to comprehend. Eyes, mouths, and limbs flickered in and out of existence, their edges dissolving into the void. And yet it was familiar. The symbols she had seen in the corridor and on the altar flashed through her mind. They had all led her here to this moment. The whispers reached a fever pitch, their voices blending into a single, commanding presence. "Release it." She shook her head, clutching the box tighter. "No. I don't know what this is, but I won't." The ground beneath her shifted, and she stumbled, nearly losing her balance. The pit seemed to respond to her defiance, its surface churning violently. A deep, guttural voice emerged from the darkness, distinct from the whispers. It was ancient, resonating with power and malice. "You cannot resist," it said. The air grew colder, and the cavern trembled as the voice spoke again. "Open the box, Sarah. Fulfill your purpose." "How do you know my name?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The entity laughed, a sound that reverberated through the cavern like a collapsing mountain. "I have always known you. You are part of this as much as I am." She stepped back, her mind racing. Was this why she had felt drawn to the house? Why she had ignored every instinct to leave? Her thoughts were interrupted by a sharp pain in her chest. She looked down to see the box glowing brightly, its surface searing her skin. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. They overlapped with the entity's voice, creating a cacophony of sound that threatened to overwhelm her. "Open it," they demanded. "Don't listen," the man's voice from before echoed faintly in her mind. Her hands trembled as she tried to pull the box away from her chest, but it wouldn't budge. It was as if it had fused to her, becoming part of her flesh. Tears streamed down her face as she screamed, her voice lost in the chaos around her. The cavern seemed to close in, the walls pulsing and writhing like living tissue. The pit roared, its surface boiling with energy. And then everything went still. The whispers stopped, the hum faded, and the cavern fell silent. Sarah collapsed to her knees, gasping for air. The box was still glowing, but the pain had subsided. She looked up, her eyes drawn to the pit, and saw a figure emerging from the darkness. The figure was humanoid but far from human. Its body was made of shifting shadows, its edges blurred and indistinct. Glowing red eyes stared down at her, filled with an intelligence that felt ancient and cruel. "You are stronger than I anticipated," it said, its voice a low rumble. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The figure tilted its head, studying her. "You were chosen, Sarah. Chosen to carry the key to unlock the door between worlds." She shook her head. "I don't want any part of this." The figure laughed, a hollow, chilling sound. "It's too late for that. You are already part of it." The ground beneath her began to crumble, the edges of the pit expanding as the figure stepped closer. "You have two choices," it said. "Open the box and release me, or keep it closed and let this place become your tomb." Sarah's mind raced. Was there a third option? A way to escape without unleashing whatever this was into the world? The figure extended a hand, its long, shadowy fingers reaching toward her. "Decide, Sarah. Time is running out." The box grew warmer, its glow intensifying. The whispers returned, softer now but no less insistent. "Do it," they urged. "End this." Sarah closed her eyes, tears streaming down her face. She thought of her mother, of the life she had left behind, and of the man's warning in the circular room. She opened her eyes and made her choice. For a moment, the cavern held its breath. Sarah's trembling hands hovered over the glowing box, its pulsating warmth almost unbearable. The shadowy figure loomed closer, its crimson eyes locked onto her, radiating a presence that was both commanding and suffocating. She couldn't breathe. The choice before her was impossible. If she opened the box, she would release whatever ancient evil this entity represented into the world. If she refused, the figure's warning was clear. This cavern would become her tomb. But Sarah couldn't help wondering if death might be the preferable option. Her fingers tightened on the box as she glanced down at it. The carvings on its surface seemed alive, shifting and twisting like serpents under her gaze. Each symbol felt like it was whispering directly to her soul, urging her to surrender. The figure took another step forward, its shadowy form towering over her now. Its voice rumbled through the cavern like distant thunder. You cannot delay forever, Sarah. The key was forged for this moment. You were forged for this moment? Her heart raced, pounding against her ribcage as though it wanted to escape her chest. She glanced around the cavern, desperately searching for something, anything, that could offer a third way out. The pit boiled below her, the swirling darkness within almost hypnotic. And then she thought of the man's words in the circular room. Don't let it win, he had said. Her mind clung to those words like a lifeline, but their meaning remained maddeningly unclear. Was this a test? A trick? Why me? She asked, her voice breaking. Why do I have to do this? The shadow figure stopped its advance. Its head tilted slightly as though considering her question. Do you think this is a coincidence? It asked, its tone almost amused. The house. The box. Your arrival. Everything has been by design, Sarah. You were chosen long before you ever set foot here. That doesn't answer my question, she shouted, her voice echoing off the cavern walls. The figure leaned closer, its glowing eyes narrowing. Because you are weak. Because you are broken. And because it is the broken who are easiest to shape. The words struck her like a physical blow. Her mind flashed to her mother's vacant stare, the years of anger and neglect, the crushing loneliness she had carried her entire life. No, she whispered, shaking her head. You're wrong. I'm not weak. The figure chuckled, a deep, guttural sound. Oh, Sarah, you've spent your life running from the truth. But here there is no running. There is only the choice. Her hands gripped the box tighter as her mind warred with itself. The whispers were growing louder again, intertwining with the figure's voice until they became an unbearable cacophony. Open it. Don't open it. End it. Release me. Suddenly the cavern began to tremble. The walls pulsed with light, and the pit surged violently, spewing tendrils of darkness into the air. The figure straightened, its form rippling as though it were feeding off the chaos. Time is running out, Sarah, it said. Choose. Her gaze darted to the edge of the pit, where the ground was beginning to crumble. Small rocks tumbled into the abyss, disappearing into the writhing void below. She closed her eyes, trying to block out the noise, the fear, the overwhelming pressure. She forced herself to focus, to think. And then, like a spark in the darkness, an idea took shape. The box was the key. The figure had said so itself. But keys didn't just unlock, they also locked things away. Her breath hitched as the thought crystallized. What if the box could do more than release the entity? What if it could contain it? The whispers faltered as if sensing her resolve. The figure leaned closer, its eyes narrowing. What are you thinking, Sarah? It demanded. She opened her eyes, meeting its gaze. You want me to open the box? Fine. But I don't think you're going to like what happens next. Before she could second-guess herself, she pressed her thumbs against the edges of the box and twisted. The carvings flared to life, glowing so brightly that the entire cavern was bathed in blinding light. The whispers erupted into screams, their once commanding tones now laced with panic. The figure roared, its shadowy form recoiling from the light. What are you doing? It bellowed. Sarah didn't answer. She focused all her energy on the box, feeling its warmth surge through her body. The lid cracked open and a searing beam of light shot out, striking the figure square in the chest. The cavern shook violently as the figure writhed, its form disintegrating under the onslaught of light. You cannot stop me, it screamed, its voice echoing like 1,000 thunderclaps. Sarah gritted her teeth, holding the box steady. The light intensified, consuming the figure piece by piece. And then, with a deafening roar, the figure collapsed into the pit, its shadowy tendrils dragging it down into the swirling darkness. The cavern fell silent. For a moment, Sarah remained frozen, her hands still clutching the box. The glow faded, leaving her in near total darkness. She glanced around, half expecting the figure to reappear, but the cavern remained still. Had she won? Her thoughts were interrupted by a low, guttural laugh. It came from the pit. Sarah staggered back as the darkness within the pit began to shift, coalescing into a new shape. It was smaller this time, more human-like, but no less terrifying. You think it's over? The voice said, its tone dripping with malice. This is only the beginning. The laughter echoed through the cavern, reverberating against the stone walls like the creaking of a dying ship. Sarah stumbled backward, her hands still shaking, clutching the box as if it might somehow protect her. But the laughter wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a force pressing against her mind, wrapping around her thoughts, suffocating her will to act. She wanted to scream, to run, but her feet were frozen to the cold stone floor. The darkness within the pit shifted once more. The shape that had coalesced from the void was humanoid, but unlike the figure from before, this one was smaller, more compact. It was still cloaked in shadow, but its features had become clearer, sharp, jagged edges like cracks in reality itself. Two glowing red eyes blinked open, and then a mouth formed, stretching unnaturally wide. "Did you think you could banish me?" it hissed, its voice a twisted blend of fury and amusement. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest as she took a step back, but her legs felt weak, like they might give out at any moment. The pit had become an abyss, its depths bottomless, and yet this creature, was coming back stronger than before. "Get away from me," she whispered, her voice trembling. She glanced desperately at the box in her hands, the only thing that had kept her alive so far, but she wasn't sure it could do anything more. The creature took a step forward, its form flickering like a shadow cast by an uncertain light. "You think this little box can stop me? I was born from darkness and I will return to it. You cannot hide from what you've awakened." Sarah's breathing became shallow. The whispers, those cursed whispers, returned, filling her mind with images of her worst fears, visions of her past, of her fractured family, of all the things she had never confronted. The more she fought against them, the louder they became, a cacophony of madness that threatened to drown her. She closed her eyes, trying to block them out. "I won't let you win," she said, though her voice was weak, strained. The creature laughed again, but this time, it was a low, guttural sound, as though it was savoring her fear. "You don't have a choice. I'm already inside you. You've already made your decision. This place, this curse, it's all a part of you now." The ground beneath Sarah began to shake again, and the box in her hand started to pulse violently. The glow was dim at first, but it quickly intensified, bathing her in a harsh, blinding light. The whispers grew louder, swirling around her like a whirlwind, and the creature seemed to be feeding off the chaos. "No," she gasped, stumbling backward. "No, this can't be happening again." The cavern trembled as if the very walls were alive, responding to the creature's presence. The pit below churned violently, the darkness within beginning to stir with renewed life. The figure in the pit was still only a shadow, but its shape was becoming more defined, more real. And then, just as quickly as it had all started, everything went silent. The light from the box flickered and dimmed. The whispers, once deafening, vanished into the stillness. The creature in the pit was gone, its presence a lingering shadow in Sarah's mind, but there was no physical trace of it. For a moment, Sarah allowed herself to believe that she had succeeded, that the creature had been banished. But she could still feel the weight of its gaze, heavy and unyielding, like a dark cloud looming over her. The box, once a source of fear and pain, now felt strangely warm in her hands, as though it were alive, pulsing with a sinister energy of its own. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to breathe deeply, steadying her thoughts. "Is it over?" she whispered to the darkness, her voice barely audible. "What have I done?" The cavern remained silent, the air still and thick. She glanced around, half expecting the creature to reappear, but there was nothing. Only the faint, flickering glow of the box and the oppressive silence that surrounded her. But then she heard it, a low, mournful sound like a distant wail carried on the wind. It wasn't coming from the pit. It was coming from behind her. Sarah turned quickly, her heart leaping into her throat. There, emerging from the shadows of the cavern, was a figure. It was human, or at least it looked human. A woman, dressed in tattered clothing, with hair as white as snow and eyes that glowed an eerie green. Her face was pale, gaunt, as if she had been trapped in this place for far too long. The woman's lips parted, and she spoke, her voice soft but carrying a weight of sorrow. "You've made a mistake, child." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She couldn't understand what the woman meant. How could she have made a mistake? She had to have done the right thing. She had to have stopped it. The woman stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Sarah's face. "You have awakened something far worse than you can imagine. You think the darkness is gone, but it is only waiting." Sarah's grip on the box tightened. "Who are you?" she demanded, her voice shaking. The woman's gaze softened as if pitying her. "I was once like you, a soul trapped by the curse. But I made the same choice. I thought I could control it. But the darkness, it will always find a way back." The ground trembled again, this time more violently. The walls seemed to close in, and Sarah felt a crushing weight press down on her chest. The cavern, the pit, the whispers, it was all coming back. The woman stepped forward, placing a cold, bony hand on Sarah's arm. "It is not over. It has only just begun." Suddenly, the light from the box flickered once more, and the whispers returned, louder than before, like 100 voices screaming inside her mind. The figure in the pit was not gone. It had never left. The whispers gnawed at Sarah's mind, clawing their way through her thoughts like ravenous insects. They twisted her memories, distorting her sense of reality. Her heart raced as she gripped the box tighter, as if by sheer force of will she could control whatever was coming. But deep down, she knew that she was only delaying the inevitable. The woman's cold hand still rested on her arm, a reminder that this was not over. Sarah wanted to pull away, but the touch seemed to ground her, as though the woman's presence was the only thing keeping her tethered to reality. And yet, everything in her screamed that the woman was part of the nightmare, the same nightmare that had nearly consumed her once before. The cavern around them began to shift, the walls pulsating like the beat of a heart. The ground quaked beneath Sarah's feet, the sound of distant thunder rumbling in the distance. She could feel the temperature drop, the air becoming thick and suffocating as the darkness gathered. The woman's face, pale and gaunt, remained expressionless, but Sarah could see the faint flicker of something in her eyes. Regret, perhaps, or a warning. "It's coming back," Sarah whispered, barely recognizing her own voice. The woman nodded, her lips parting as if she were about to speak, but then the whispers rose to a crescendo, drowning out all sound. Sarah's mind was flooded with images, horrible, fragmented images, that made her stomach churn. She saw flashes of a man, his face twisted in agony, and a woman weeping as she clutched her child's lifeless body. These were memories, Sarah realized. Her memories twisted and warped. "No," she screamed, shaking her head to rid herself of the visions. "This isn't real." But the woman didn't move. She merely watched, as if resigned to whatever fate was about to unfold. Sarah stumbled backward, her vision spinning, the weight of the box heavy in her hands. It was as if the very air around her was charged with malevolent energy, thick with the sense of something ancient and powerful. The whispers faded, only to be replaced by the sound of footsteps, slow, deliberate, like a predator toying with its prey. "Why don't you understand?" the woman said, her voice now a soft murmur, barely audible over the growing noise. "The darkness is not an enemy. It is a part of you. It always has been." Sarah wanted to shout, to argue, but her throat felt tight, constricted by fear. The air was thick with the smell of rot, as though the very earth was decaying beneath her feet. She felt as if she were suffocating, drowning in an overwhelming sense of dread. Suddenly the footsteps stopped. Sarah's breath caught in her throat as a figure emerged from the shadows, a dark silhouette that stood tall and still in the center of the cavern. It was humanoid but wrong. Its body seemed to flicker, shifting like smoke, its edges not quite solid, not quite real. It spoke, and its voice was a deep, guttural growl that sent a shiver down Sarah's spine. "You can't escape me. Not anymore." The words hit Sarah like a physical blow, and her knees buckled beneath her. She collapsed to the ground, gasping for air as the creature's presence pressed in on her from all sides. The darkness seemed to close in, suffocating her, as if the very cavern itself were alive, feeding off her fear. "Get away from her," the woman said suddenly, her voice sharper now, almost commanding. Sarah looked up to see the woman stepping forward, her face set in a grim expression. For the first time, there was a flicker of emotion in her eyes. Fear. But it wasn't fear for herself. It was fear for Sarah. The creature's flickering form turned toward her, its red eyes glowing brighter. The whispers returned, louder than before, but they now carried a new edge, a mocking, triumphant tone. "You can't stop me. She belongs to me now." The woman moved faster than Sarah could follow, crossing the distance between them in a blur. She reached out, her fingers grazing the air just above the creature's head. For a moment, everything went still, and Sarah felt a sharp pang of hope, a fleeting belief that they might be able to defeat it, that they could somehow fight back. But then, with a sickening lurch, the creature extended its hand toward the woman, and a dark shadow poured from its fingers, enveloping her in an instant. "No!" Sarah screamed, scrambling to her feet. She reached for the box, its warmth almost comforting now, and thrust it toward the creature, hoping against hope that it would work, that it would somehow drive it away. But the creature's form didn't falter. Instead, it twisted, contorting into a shape Sarah could barely comprehend. Its mouth stretched wide, wider than seemed possible, revealing rows upon rows of sharp, gleaming teeth. "This is your fate," it hissed, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat as it reached for her. With a roar, Sarah flung the box toward the creature, her fear and desperation guiding her hands. The moment the box left her fingertips, everything seemed to slow down. The cavern, the shadows, the creature, they all froze in place, suspended in time. The box glowed with an intense, blinding light, a force of unimaginable power. Sarah's heart raced, but she didn't look away. She couldn't. She watched, wide-eyed, as the creature's form began to waver, its edges flickering like a broken television screen. And then, with a sound like 1,000 cracks splitting the air, the creature let out a terrible scream. It echoed through the cavern, reverberating in Sarah's bones, shaking the very foundation of the earth beneath her. The light from the box intensified, blinding her. Sarah shielded her eyes, but it was no use. The light consumed everything. When it finally faded, Sarah was alone. The cavern was silent again, the oppressive weight of darkness lifted. The woman was gone, and the creature with her. But Sarah knew this wasn't over. She knew that whatever had been awakened could not be easily vanquished. The box, still in her hands, seemed to hum with energy as though it were waiting for the next time she would be forced to use it. Sarah looked around the cavern, the remnants of her past still lingering in the shadows. She didn't know what had just happened or what would come next, but she did know one thing for certain. The darkness would always return. And then, just as she began to turn toward the exit, something caught her eye, something that made her freeze in her tracks. On the far wall of the cavern, written in what looked like blood, were symbols. Symbols she had seen before. Her breath caught in her throat as realization hit her. This was not the end. The darkness that had swallowed Sarah seemed to stretch on forever, wrapping her in a cold, suffocating embrace. She couldn't breathe, couldn't move, as if the air itself had turned to stone. Her limbs felt paralyzed, heavy, her body numb from the shock of the fall. But something primal within her, urged her to fight, to claw her way back to the surface. She couldn't stay here, couldn't let the darkness consume her. She had to keep going. With every ounce of strength, Sarah forced her body to move, her fingers scraping against the rough, unseen surface beneath her. She gasped, her breath ragged, as she struggled to lift her head. Her surroundings were completely pitch black, an oppressive void that swallowed every sound, every thought. There was nothing, no point of reference, no sense of direction. Just an endless, smothering blackness. Then came the whisper, soft at first, like a rustle of wind, but unmistakable. It curled around her mind, threading its way into her thoughts like a serpent. "Welcome back." The voice was different now, hollow and echoing. Sarah recognized it, though she couldn't place from where. It was like the voice had been waiting for her, and now that she had returned, it would be there to claim her. Her heart raced in her chest, and she forced herself to sit up, her body trembling violently. The air around her was thick, like it had been soaked in something rotten. The stench of decay assaulted her senses, and she gagged, fighting the rising panic that threatened to overwhelm her. It was impossible to see, but she could feel the presence. It was all around her, in the very air she breathed. Something was near, something that didn't belong to this world. And then she heard it, the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. Her body stiffened, the hairs on her neck rising in terror. She wanted to scream, but her throat was dry, her voice lost somewhere in the void. The footsteps grew louder, echoing off invisible walls until they stopped just out of reach. "Sarah?" It was the same voice, only colder now, closer. The whispers coiled tighter around her mind, and she could feel her thoughts slipping away, her grip on reality faltering. A flash of light. It was faint, a tiny spark in the vastness of the darkness, but it was enough. She turned toward it, drawn to it as though it were the only thing tethering her to the world she knew. She began crawling, her hands sliding against the cold ground, desperate to reach it. The light flickered, dimming, but still she crawled toward it, her body shaking with fear and exhaustion. The footsteps were behind her now, the presence drawing nearer with each passing second. It was almost like the darkness itself was alive, feeding on her fear, growing stronger as she drew closer to the light. The whisper came again, now accompanied by a low growl, a rumble that seemed to shake the very air. "You shouldn't have come back." And then the light was gone. Sarah's body froze. The world around her dissolved into nothingness, leaving her in a void of pure, unrelenting darkness. Her heart hammered in her chest, the sound deafening in the silence that followed. Panic surged through her, but she couldn't move. The weight of the void pressed down on her, suffocating her until she could barely breathe. It was then that she heard it, the sound of something scraping, moving across the ground. Slow, deliberate, like nails dragged across stone. And then a voice, gravelly, low, came from all around her. "You should have listened." Sarah's body convulsed as she tried to stand, but the ground beneath her feet shifted, unstable, as though it were shifting with a mind of its own. She fell, her palms slamming into the cold floor, and then a figure emerged from the darkness. It was tall, its silhouette barely visible against the swirling blackness. Its form was indistinct, like smoke or mist, but it was there. Watching. Waiting. Sarah couldn't tear her eyes away. "You can't escape what's already inside of you," the voice rumbled, its tone laced with something darker, something deeper. "You've always known this place, Sarah. It's been calling to you. It's always been a part of you." Her mind spun, the words reverberating in her skull. "No, that's not true." The figure took a step forward and Sarah recoiled. But as it moved, the darkness around her shifted, drawing tighter, as if the very walls were closing in, pressing her toward the figure. The figure's shape became clearer, its features twisting in the darkness. Its face was distorted, its eyes hollow, its mouth twisted into a grotesque grin. It was the woman, the one who had been guiding her, leading her toward this nightmare. But now she was something else, something monstrous. Sarah opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came. The air was thick with an oppressive silence, and the figure took another step forward, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. "You're not just here to find answers, Sarah. You're here to finish what you started." The ground shook beneath her feet again, and this time, Sarah didn't hesitate. She ran. Her legs were weak, her body trembling, but she had no choice. She had to get away. The figure loomed behind her, its presence a dark, suffocating cloud that followed her every step. She didn't know where to go, only that she couldn't stay here, in this place that was devouring her. The darkness seemed to stretch on forever, the walls closing in on her, the air thick and stifling. She felt as though she were running through an endless tunnel, the ground beneath her feet shifting and buckling with every step. And then she saw it, a crack of light up ahead, faint and distant, but unmistakable. It was a way out. But just as she reached for it, the ground beneath her feet gave way. Sarah screamed as she fell into the abyss, her body tumbling through the darkness. She could feel the weight of the fall, the sensation of plummeting into nothingness, until she hit the ground with a sickening thud. The air was cold, and for a moment, everything was still. She lay there, gasping for breath, her body aching, her mind spinning. She couldn't move. She couldn't think. And then she heard it. A whisper, faint but clear. "Welcome home." The world around Sarah blurred, the air thick with a heavy, suffocating silence. Her body, still sprawled across the cold ground, ached with every breath, each one like a struggle against the weight of her past and the darkness that had been chasing her. Her mind, still reeling from the fall, felt like it was spiraling away, caught between the horrifying figure, the whispers, and the suffocating void. She didn't know what was real anymore, or if any of it had ever been. But there was one thing she knew: she couldn't stay down here. Not like this. With a desperate, shaking breath, Sarah pushed herself to her hands and knees, the world spinning around her as she tried to find her footing. The ground beneath her was uneven, like the earth had buckled in on itself. Every step she took felt like she was walking through thick, sticky mud, dragging herself through a sea of unseen terrors. She blinked, trying to focus. There was a light, faint, flickering like a dying flame in the distance. It felt like a dream, something too fragile to reach, but it was the only thing left. It was a promise, a hope. Without thinking, she moved toward it. Her legs were unsteady, her body trembling, but she kept going, her eyes locked on the light. The whispers still echoed in her ears, distant but growing louder, more urgent. They were all around her now, impossible to ignore, twisting through her thoughts. "Sarah?" She stumbled, falling once again, her hands scraping against the rough ground. She didn't look up, she couldn't. She had to keep moving. The light was closer now, within reach, and her breath came faster, more frantic. She could feel something shifting behind her, like the air itself was alive, watching, waiting. Something was following her, drawing closer, closing in. Every step she took felt like it was being matched by something else, something darker. "Sarah?" The voice was clearer now, and when she finally looked up, her heart stopped. Standing in front of her, just a few feet away, was a door. It was old, worn with age, and it stood there like an entrance to another world. Its frame was jagged, the wood cracked, and the faintest glow seemed to seep from the cracks. There was something almost inviting about it, but it felt wrong, like a trap, a last chance to escape. Her instincts screamed at her to turn away, to run, but her feet carried her forward anyway. She reached for the door, her hands shaking, and in that instant, the whispers grew louder, more frantic. "Don't open it." But Sarah had already gripped the handle. The moment her fingers touched it, the air around her seemed to shudder. The whispers stopped. The world held its breath. And then she turned the handle. The door creaked open, revealing nothing but an endless void, black, impenetrable, and consuming. She hesitated, staring into the abyss, knowing that crossing that threshold meant stepping into something unknown, something dangerous. But it was the only way out. She had no other choice. With a deep breath, Sarah stepped forward. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, everything changed. The world twisted. The darkness that had been suffocating her seemed to fold in on itself, closing in faster than she could react. The air grew thick, suffused with a terrible pressure that felt like it was crushing her chest. The whispers were back, louder, frantic, angry. And the figure, the one that had been following her, tormenting her, was here. It was standing behind her, close enough that she could feel its breath on her neck. "You shouldn't have come," the voice said, now clearer than ever. Sarah's heart hammered in her chest. She had to keep going. She couldn't stop now. The ground beneath her feet shifted, pulling her forward, deeper into the void. There was no escape, no way to fight back. It was pulling her into itself, dragging her into whatever nightmare lay beyond the door. But Sarah didn't stop. She couldn't. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps as she moved faster, each step feeling like a struggle against the crushing weight of the world around her. The darkness twisted, thickening, suffocating her in its grip. The whispers were all she could hear, drowning out everything else. They were inside her head now, gnawing at her thoughts. "You can't leave. You can't escape. You belong here." The figure was close now, so close that she could feel its presence, a coldness that seeped into her bones. It was behind her, its breath like a gust of icy wind. Sarah stumbled, her feet slipping, but she pushed forward, her eyes locked on the faint light ahead. It was so close now, so close that she could almost reach out and touch it. And then, she fell. The ground beneath her feet disappeared entirely, and she was falling again, tumbling into a deep, bottomless pit. Her body twisted in the air, weightless for a moment, and then, everything stopped. She landed with a sickening thud, her body hitting the ground with enough force to knock the breath from her lungs. The world spun around her, her vision blurring, her mind racing. She couldn't breathe. And then, slowly, the darkness began to recede. The whispers faded, but their echoes lingered, like a distant memory she couldn't quite grasp. The air around her was still, heavy with the scent of something rotten, something ancient. She opened her eyes, and for the first time in what felt like forever, she saw the world around her clearly. The room was bare, empty except for the faintest remnants of something once there, scraps of paper, faded pictures, old furniture. It was as though time had forgotten this place. And yet, it felt familiar. She couldn't place it at first, but there was something about it, something she couldn't quite shake. She stood, her body still aching, and took in her surroundings. It was a small, dimly lit room, and in the corner, she saw a mirror. It was cracked, its edges jagged, but it reflected something that made her blood run cold. Her face. It wasn't her. Not completely. There was something wrong with it. Her eyes were dark, sunken, her skin pale and cracked, as if she had been here for longer than she could remember. And in the reflection, standing behind her, was the figure. Grint. The world around her twisted one final time. A door behind her creaked open, and the whispers returned, louder than ever. They filled the air with urgency, with darkness, with hunger. But Sarah knew, deep down she knew, it was never truly over. The force had always been there, waiting, watching. And as the last vestiges of hope slipped away, she realized, it wasn't about escaping. It was about surviving. For as long as she could. Story 2. It wasn't supposed to be this dark. The headlights of Elliot Grayson's beat-up car barely pierced the dense fog that clung to the winding road like a living thing. Trees loomed on either side, skeletal branches clawing at the gray sky. He had taken the job out of desperation, a last-ditch attempt to resurrect his career after too many bad decisions. But as the road narrowed and the trees grew closer, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that this assignment was going to cost him more than it was worth. Black Hollow. Even the name felt wrong, like a whisper you weren't supposed to hear. Officially, he was here to investigate Grimwood House, a crumbling relic tied to a series of unsolved disappearances spanning a century. Unofficially, he was chasing shadows, trying to make sense of the fragments of his own past. There was a reason this story had fallen into his lap, though he'd refused to admit it. As his car crept along the gravel driveway, the house finally came into view. Grimwood House stood at the heart of a clearing, its silhouette sharp against the twilight sky. The structure seemed to sag under the weight of its own history, with warped shutters and a roof that bowed inward as if the house itself had been holding its breath for too long. Elliot parked and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. The air was heavy, damp with the promise of rain. He retrieved his duffel bag from the back seat, slinging it over one shoulder before approaching the house. A broken lantern hung from a rusted chain above the front door, swaying slightly though there was no wind. The door was partially ajar. Of course it was. Inside, the house smelled of mildew and rot, a cocktail of decay that hit Elliot like a physical blow. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam slicing through the oppressive darkness. Dust motes swirled in the air, disturbed for the first time in years. The floorboards creaked under his weight, their groans echoing in the vast, empty foyer. The house had been abandoned for decades, but it didn't feel empty. Elliot felt watched, the hair on the back of his neck prickling as his flashlight illuminated faded wallpaper, tarnished picture frames, and furniture draped in white sheets that looked eerily like shrouds. He set his bag down and tried to shake off the unease. "It's just a house," he muttered under his breath, though the words felt hollow. He had spent his career debunking ghost stories and urban legends, but Grimwood House had a reputation even skeptics couldn't ignore. The stories ranged from the mundane, flickering lights and cold spots, to the outright horrifying. People claimed to hear voices, see shadows moving in the corners of their eyes. And then there were the disappearances. Elliot had dismissed most of it as folklore, a way for a dying town to keep its only landmark relevant. But now, standing in the house, he wasn't so sure. The first hour was uneventful. He moved from room to room, taking photographs and jotting down notes in a battered notebook. The house was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and forgotten rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. Most of the furniture was still intact, though warped and water-stained, as if the house had been left in a hurry. In the kitchen, he found plates still stacked in the sink, their edges chipped and discolored. He paused in front of a large fireplace in the living room. Above it hung a faded portrait of a family, a man and a woman, stiff and unsmiling, with two children sitting between them. Their eyes seemed to follow him, and the longer he looked, the more it seemed that their expressions changed, shifting subtly into something less human. Elliot turned away, the beam of his flashlight jittering as his hand trembled. "Get a grip," he muttered, but his voice didn't sound convincing. By the time he reached the second floor, the sun had set completely, and the house was shrouded in darkness. He tried to ignore the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest, focusing instead on the task at hand. But the house seemed to resist him as if it didn't want him there. The air grew colder with every step, and the walls felt closer, the shadows thicker. He stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway. Unlike the others, which were warped and peeling, this one looked almost new. The brass doorknob gleamed in the light of his flashlight. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the knob. A part of him wanted to turn back, to leave the house and never look back. But another part, the journalist in him, wouldn't let him. Elliot pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. On the floor, scratched into the wood, was a message: "It knows you're here." Elliot stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. The letters were jagged, as if carved in a frenzy. He knelt to get a closer look, running his fingers over the grooves. The scratches were fresh. Whoever had done this had been here recently. Or maybe they still were. A sudden sound broke the silence, a soft creak like a footstep. Elliot froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He swung his flashlight toward the doorway, but the hallway was empty. "Hello?" His voice sounded small, swallowed by the house. No answer. Just the groaning of the house, the distant sound of dripping water. He stood slowly, his knees trembling. For the first time, he considered leaving. He could sleep in his car, return in the morning when the light would make everything less terrifying. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew he wouldn't. He'd come too far, risked too much. He returned to the foyer to retrieve his bag, intending to set up camp in one of the less oppressive rooms. As he reached for the bag, his flashlight flickered and died. He swore under his breath, fumbling in the dark for a spare battery. The house seemed to grow quieter, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. Then he heard it. A low, guttural whisper coming from somewhere behind him. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Elliot's blood ran cold as he turned slowly, his eyes straining to see in the darkness. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, though he couldn't make out the words. His hands shook as he replaced the battery in his flashlight, the beam flickering to life. He swept it across the room, the light cutting through the dark. Nothing. The room was empty. But the whisper didn't stop. Elliot's eyes darted to the staircase. Something was moving at the top, a shadow shifting and unnatural. It disappeared around the corner, leaving behind a heavy silence. "Who's there?" He called, his voice cracking. No answer. He wanted to run, to get in his car and never look back. But his feet wouldn't move. The whisper returned, this time from above, echoing down the staircase. Elliot took a hesitant step forward, his flashlight trained on the top of the stairs. His heart hammered in his chest as he climbed, each step creaking under his weight. When he reached the top, the whisper stopped. The hallway stretched out before him, empty and silent. He turned his flashlight toward the room with the scratched message, half expecting to see the shadow again. But the door was closed and the room was silent. He lowered the flashlight, taking a deep, shaky breath. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe the house was getting to him. But as he turned to head back downstairs, something caught his eye. On the wall, written in what looked like ash, was a single word: stay. The flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't come back on. It wasn't supposed to be this dark. The headlights of Elliot Grayson's beat-up car barely pierced the dense fog that clung to the winding road like a living thing. Trees loomed on either side, skeletal branches clawing at the gray sky. He had taken the job out of desperation, a last-ditch attempt to resurrect his career after too many bad decisions. But as the road narrowed and the trees grew closer, Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that this assignment was going to cost him more than it was worth. Black Hollow. Even the name felt wrong, like a whisper you weren't supposed to hear. Officially, he was here to investigate Grimwood House, a crumbling relic tied to a series of unsolved disappearances spanning a century. Unofficially, he was chasing shadows, trying to make sense of the fragments of his own past. There was a reason this story had fallen into his lap, though he'd refused to admit it. As his car crept along the gravel driveway, the house finally came into view. Grimwood House stood at the heart of a clearing, its silhouette sharp against the twilight sky. The structure seemed to sag under the weight of its own history, with warped shutters and a roof that bowed inward as if the house itself had been holding its breath for too long. Elliot parked and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel. The air was heavy, damp with the promise of rain. He retrieved his duffel bag from the back seat, slinging it over one shoulder before approaching the house. A broken lantern hung from a rusted chain above the front door, swaying slightly though there was no wind. The door was partially ajar. Of course it was. Inside, the house smelled of mildew and rot, a cocktail of decay that hit Elliot like a physical blow. He clicked on his flashlight, the beam slicing through the oppressive darkness. Dust motes swirled in the air, disturbed for the first time in years. The floorboards creaked under his weight, their groans echoing in the vast, empty foyer. The house had been abandoned for decades, but it didn't feel empty. Elliot felt watched, the hair on the back of his neck prickling as his flashlight illuminated faded wallpaper, tarnished picture frames, and furniture draped in white sheets that looked eerily like shrouds. He set his bag down and tried to shake off the unease. "It's just a house," he muttered under his breath, though the words felt hollow. He had spent his career debunking ghost stories and urban legends, but Grimwood House had a reputation even skeptics couldn't ignore. The stories ranged from the mundane, flickering lights and cold spots, to the outright horrifying. People claimed to hear voices, see shadows moving in the corners of their eyes. And then there were the disappearances. Elliot had dismissed most of it as folklore, a way for a dying town to keep its only landmark relevant. But now, standing in the house, he wasn't so sure. The first hour was uneventful. He moved from room to room, taking photographs and jotting down notes in a battered notebook. The house was a labyrinth of narrow hallways and forgotten rooms, each one more decrepit than the last. Most of the furniture was still intact, though warped and water-stained, as if the house had been left in a hurry. In the kitchen, he found plates still stacked in the sink, their edges chipped and discolored. He paused in front of a large fireplace in the living room. Above it hung a faded portrait of a family, a man and a woman, stiff and unsmiling, with two children sitting between them. Their eyes seemed to follow him, and the longer he looked, the more it seemed that their expressions changed, shifting subtly into something less human. Elliot turned away, the beam of his flashlight jittering as his hand trembled. "Get a grip," he muttered, but his voice didn't sound convincing. By the time he reached the second floor, the sun had set completely, and the house was shrouded in darkness. He tried to ignore the feeling of dread that had settled in his chest, focusing instead on the task at hand. But the house seemed to resist him as if it didn't want him there. The air grew colder with every step, and the walls felt closer, the shadows thicker. He stopped in front of a door at the end of the hallway. Unlike the others, which were warped and peeling, this one looked almost new. The brass doorknob gleamed in the light of his flashlight. He hesitated, his fingers hovering over the knob. A part of him wanted to turn back, to leave the house and never look back. But another part, the journalist in him, wouldn't let him. Elliot pushed the door open. The room was empty, save for a single chair in the center. On the floor, scratched into the wood, was a message. "It knows you're here." Elliot stepped back, his breath catching in his throat. The letters were jagged, as if carved in a frenzy. He knelt to get a closer look, running his fingers over the grooves. The scratches were fresh. Whoever had done this had been here recently. Or maybe they still were. A sudden sound broke the silence, a soft creak like a footstep. Elliot froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He swung his flashlight toward the doorway, but the hallway was empty. "Hello?" His voice sounded small, swallowed by the house. No answer. Just the groaning of the house, the distant sound of dripping water. He stood slowly, his knees trembling. For the first time he considered leaving. He could sleep in his car, return in the morning when the light would make everything less terrifying. But even as the thought crossed his mind, he knew he wouldn't. He'd come too far, risked too much. He returned to the foyer to retrieve his bag, intending to set up camp in one of the less oppressive rooms. As he reached for the bag, his flashlight flickered and died. He swore under his breath, fumbling in the dark for a spare battery. The house seemed to grow quieter, the silence pressing in on him like a weight. Then he heard it. A low, guttural whisper coming from somewhere behind him. It was faint, barely audible, but unmistakable. Elliot's blood ran cold as he turned slowly, his eyes straining to see in the darkness. The whisper grew louder, more insistent, though he couldn't make out the words. His hands shook as he replaced the battery in his flashlight, the beam flickering to life. He swept it across the room, the light cutting through the dark. Nothing. The room was empty. But the whisper didn't stop. Elliot's eyes darted to the staircase. Something was moving at the top, a shadow shifting and unnatural. It disappeared around the corner, leaving behind a heavy silence. "Who's there?" he called, his voice cracking. No answer. He wanted to run, to get in his car and never look back. But his feet wouldn't move. The whisper returned, this time from above, echoing down the staircase. Elliot took a hesitant step forward, his flashlight trained on the top of the stairs. His heart hammered in his chest as he climbed, each step creaking under his weight. When he reached the top, the whisper stopped. The hallway stretched out before him, empty and silent. He turned his flashlight toward the room with the scratched message, half expecting to see the shadow again. But the door was closed and the room was silent. He lowered the flashlight, taking a deep, shaky breath. Maybe he was imagining things. Maybe the house was getting to him. But as he turned to head back downstairs, something caught his eye. On the wall, written in what looked like ash, was a single word: stay. The flashlight flickered again, and this time it didn't come back on. Elliot awoke to the sound of whispers. They were faint at first, like leaves brushing against each other in the wind. As he lay in the darkened bedroom of Grimwood House, his eyes fixed on the cracked ceiling, the whispers seemed to multiply, growing louder. He sat up, listening intently. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was within the walls. The air felt heavy, oppressive. A dull ache settled at the base of his skull, as though the very atmosphere of the house pressed against him. The old bed creaked beneath him as he swung his legs over the side, his bare feet touching the cold wooden floor. "Hello?" His voice sounded feeble, barely more than a croak. The whispers stopped. Elliot froze, holding his breath. The silence was worse. It felt alive, watching, waiting. Then came a creak from the hallway outside his room. Slow, deliberate. He grabbed the flashlight from the nightstand and flicked it on. The weak beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the peeling wallpaper and warped floorboards. The house, he reminded himself, was old. It would make noises. That's all it was. But he didn't believe it. The hallway stretched out before him, impossibly long, the flashlight casting long shadows that seemed to ripple and move. Elliot forced himself forward, one cautious step at a time, the sound of his breathing loud in his ears. At the end of the hallway was a door. It hadn't been there before. The hair on the back of his neck stood on end. He was sure it hadn't been there. The door was strange, its surface rough and scarred, as though clawed at by desperate hands. Deep grooves ran across the wood, and the doorknob was rusted, barely clinging to the door. Elliot approached, every instinct screaming at him to turn back. He reached for the doorknob, his hand trembling. As his fingers brushed the cold metal, the whispers returned, louder now, insistent. "Elliot." He yanked his hand back, heart pounding. The whispers stopped again. His name had been clear this time, unmistakable, spoken by a voice that was neither male nor female but a strange, guttural amalgamation of the two. Shaking, he raised the flashlight, the beam trembling as it illuminated the door once more. A faint sound reached him, muffled voices, distant but growing closer, like a crowd murmuring just beyond the threshold. His chest tightened. "I'm just imagining things," he whispered to himself. Then, with a sudden, deafening bang, the door slammed open, revealing pitch blackness beyond. Elliot staggered back, nearly dropping the flashlight. The beam fell on the floor, the light sputtering for a moment before stabilizing. The door now stood wide open, but the space beyond was impenetrable darkness, as if it consumed the light itself. A faint, rhythmic tapping came from within the darkness. Tap, tap, tap. Elliot swallowed hard, unable to move. The sound grew louder, closer. Then from the shadows a shape began to emerge. It was small at first, childlike, its movements jerky and unnatural, as though it were being dragged forward by invisible strings. "Who's there?" Elliot's voice cracked. The figure stopped just at the edge of the light. It was a boy, no older than 10, with pale, sickly skin and hollow eyes that seemed to sink into his skull. He was dressed in clothes from another era, a tattered shirt and suspenders, his bare feet caked with dirt. "Help me," the boy whispered, his voice barely audible. Elliot stepped back. What do you mean?" The boy raised a hand, pointing to the darkness behind him. His lips quivered as he spoke again, his words dripping with despair. "It's coming." Before Elliot could react, the boy was yanked back into the shadows, his scream piercing the silence. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the walls, leaving Elliot staring at it, his heart hammering in his chest. Elliot didn't remember how he got back to his room. The flashlight was still clutched in his hand, the batteries nearly drained. The whispers were gone, but his mind raced with questions. Who was the boy? And what was coming? Sleep was impossible. Instead, Elliot spent the rest of the night poring over the journals he had found earlier. Most were mundane, accounts of daily life in Grimwood House, but one caught his attention. The handwriting was erratic, scrawled in haste, and the pages were stained with something dark. It was a diary belonging to someone named Annalise. March 3rd, 1928. The boy came again last night. He's afraid. He says the Watcher sees us all. I told him not to worry, that Father would keep us safe, but he didn't believe me. I'm starting to think I don't believe me either. March 6th, 1928. Father is hiding something in the attic. I heard him talking to someone late last night, but when I checked, he was alone. He won't let me near the door. I don't think he's the same anymore. March 10th, 1928. The Watcher is real. I saw it. Its eyes are everywhere, watching, waiting. The boy says there's no escape. I believe him now. Elliot's stomach churned as he closed the diary. The boy in Annalise's entries? Was it the same boy he'd seen? The first rays of dawn broke through the window, but they brought no comfort. Outside, the forest surrounding Grimwood House was cloaked in a heavy mist, the skeletal branches of the trees reaching like grasping hands toward the house. Elliot's gaze fell on the locked attic door. Whatever was going on in this house, the answer was up there. He would need to find the key. The morning came reluctantly, as if the sun itself feared touching Grimwood House. A pale light filtered through the dense fog that enveloped the property, but the oppressive heaviness inside the house hadn't lifted. Elliot couldn't shake the feeling that the place was alive, breathing in the same air he did and watching. He stood in the kitchen, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. His eyes were drawn to the window overlooking the backyard, where an overgrown garden bled into the forest. Beyond the trees, a cluster of jagged shapes jutted out from the earth. Gravestones. Elliot felt a cold sweat break out on his brow. The faint outlines of crosses and headstones were barely visible through the morning mist, but they were unmistakable. He grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. The backyard was a battlefield of tangled weeds and thorny vines. Every step was a struggle as Elliot pushed through the thicket, his boots sinking into the damp earth. The fog hung low, muting the world around him, and the silence was deafening. When he reached the cemetery, he stopped short. The gravestones were old, their surfaces worn smooth by time, but some inscriptions were still legible. As he moved closer, a chill crept down his spine. Eleanor Grayson, William Grayson, Lydia Grayson, all bore his family name. Elliot's hands trembled as he traced the letters etched into the stone. These weren't distant relatives or long-forgotten ancestors. These were names he recognized. Eleanor was his grandmother, William his uncle. But the dates didn't make sense. They were wrong. Eleanor's stone read, 1905, 1927. But Elliot remembered her alive and well into his childhood, knitting scarves for him on the front porch of her old house. This can't be right, he whispered. The fog seemed to thicken around him and the air grew colder. He moved to the next grave and froze. Elliot Grayson, 1986, 2024. The blood drained from his face. His own name. His own birth year. The death year matched the present day. The earth beneath the stone was freshly turned as if waiting for him. No. No, no, no. The grave marker loomed like a taunt, daring him to deny what he saw. He backed away, stumbling over an exposed root. His heart thundered in his chest and his breath came in ragged gasps. A distant sound broke the silence, a low, mournful creak. He whipped around, searching for the source. At the edge of the cemetery, half buried in the weeds, stood an ancient swing set. The rusted chains swayed gently, though there was no wind. Elliot stared at the empty swing, its rhythmic creaking growing louder. He was about to turn away when he saw it. A figure sat on the swing. It was the boy from the night before, his pale, hollow eyes fixed on Elliot. His feet dangled just above the ground, swaying with the motion of the swing. "Why are you here?" the boy asked, his voice soft but cutting through the mist like a knife. Elliot took a step back, his pulse racing. Who are you? What do you want?" The boy tilted his head as if considering the question. "You shouldn't have come back. It's awake now." "What's awake?" Elliot's voice was a trembling whisper. The boy's expression darkened. "The Watcher knows you. It remembers your family." Before Elliot could respond, the boy pointed to something behind him. Elliot turned and gasped. The fresh grave was no longer empty. A figure stood beside the headstone, tall and thin, its silhouette barely visible through the fog. It didn't move, but its presence was overwhelming, oppressive, like the weight of the entire cemetery pressing down on him. The boy's voice came again, quiet but urgent. "Run." Elliot didn't need to be told twice. He burst through the back door of Grimwood House, slamming it shut behind him. His chest heaved and he braced himself against the wall, trying to steady his breathing. The cemetery, the grave, the boy. None of it made sense, but one thing was clear. This house, this place was wrong. The house seemed different now, darker even in the light of day. Shadows stretched unnaturally long across the floor, and the air buzzed with an almost imperceptible hum. He needed answers. Elliot made his way to the library. If there was any clue about the cemetery, or the strange figure he'd seen, it would be in the house's records. He rifled through shelves of dusty tomes, brittle newspapers, and faded photographs. At last he found something, a ledger labeled the Grayson family legacy. He opened it carefully. The pages were yellowed and brittle, filled with meticulous handwriting. One entry caught his eye. April 17, 1892. Asterisk, the pact is sealed. Grimwood House will stand as the boundary, the tether. Our bloodline will guard it as was agreed. The Watcher must not awaken. Asterisk. Elliot's mouth went dry. The Watcher. The boy had mentioned it. The figure in the cemetery, was that it? His fingers traced the words, and beneath the entry was a symbol, one he recognized. It was the same mark that had been burned into his arm. Night fell quickly. Elliot sat in the living room, the ledger open on the table in front of him. He was no closer to understanding what was happening, but one thing was clear. His family was tied to this place and to whatever lurked in its shadows. The sound of scratching interrupted his thoughts. It was faint at first, then grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from above. The attic. Elliot's eyes flicked toward the ceiling. The sound was relentless now, like nails scraping against wood. He stood, his legs shaky. He didn't want to go, but the house seemed to compel him. Each step up the staircase felt heavier than the last, as though unseen hands were pulling him back. When he reached the attic door, he stopped. The scratching had ceased. He tried the handle, it was still locked, but something else caught his eye. At his feet lay a small, rusted key, as though it had been left there for him. Elliot hesitated, then picked it up. The house seemed to hold its breath as he slid the key into the lock and turned it. The door creaked open, revealing darkness. The attic loomed above him, but something in Elliot hesitated. A deep, primal instinct screamed that he wasn't ready, not yet. He took an unconscious step back from the gaping darkness above and turned, his feet carrying him down the staircase instead. The house groaned around him as though protesting his retreat. He needed air, time to think, but as he reached the first floor, a new sound echoed through the house. A dull, rhythmic thud-thud-thud like a heartbeat pulsing from deep within. It was coming from the basement. Elliot froze, his heart pounding in sync with the ominous noise. "No way," he whispered. But the sound grew louder, insistent, like a summons. Elliot stood at the top of the basement stairs, the door slightly ajar. The smell hit him first, a sharp metallic tang that made his stomach churn. It wasn't the musty scent of disuse he'd expected. It smelled raw. He fumbled for the light switch, but nothing happened. The bulb had burned out long ago, leaving only the weak beam of his flashlight to pierce the darkness below. The thudding grew louder. Step by step, he descended into the void, his flashlight trembling in his grip. The wooden stairs creaked under his weight, each sound amplified in the oppressive silence. As he reached the bottom, the air grew colder, biting at his skin. The basement was vast, much larger than he'd expected, with low-hanging beams and walls lined with decaying shelves. Old tools and rusted metal glinted faintly in the light. The thudding stopped. Elliot scanned the room, his flashlight casting long, jittery shadows. In the center of the floor was a trapdoor, its edges reinforced with heavy iron. Strange symbols had been etched into the wood, similar to the ones burned into his arm. What the hell? The trapdoor began to tremble. Elliot stumbled back, nearly dropping his flashlight. A low, guttural sound emanated from beneath the door, growing louder, more frantic, like something alive and enraged. The edges of the trapdoor began to splinter, as if whatever was beneath it was clawing to get out. A voice echoed in his mind, not his own but intrusive and commanding. Asterisk, do not open it. Asterisk. Elliot staggered, gripping his head. The voice was like static, overwhelming and painful. But another sound broke through, the boy's voice, faint but urgent. You have to see. You have to know. The trapdoor shuddered violently, the iron reinforcements groaning as they began to give way. Elliot's instincts screamed for him to run, but his feet carried him forward instead, drawn by something he couldn't explain. He knelt by the trapdoor, his hand hovering over the latch. His breath came in shallow gasps. Before he could act, the room plunged into darkness. Elliot's flashlight flickered and died, leaving him in pitch blackness. Panic set in. He scrambled back, his hand searching for the flashlight, but it was gone. The basement was silent now, unnervingly so, as if the entire world had been swallowed up. Then came the voice again, soft but chilling. Elliot. It wasn't the boy this time. It was deeper, inhuman, and far too close. He turned, his eyes straining to see in the dark. A faint glow began to rise from the trapdoor, casting an eerie green light across the room. Shadows twisted and danced along the walls, forming shapes that seemed almost alive. A figure emerged from the glow. It was tall, impossibly tall, its form distorted and unnatural. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky and inhuman. Its face, or what should have been a face, was a void, a hollow expanse of nothingness. Elliot couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The figure reached out, its elongated hand stretching toward him. Why are you here? It asked, its voice a guttural snarl. Elliot found his voice, though it was barely more than a whisper. I don't know. The figure tilted its head as if considering his answer. You lie. The glow intensified, blinding him. Elliot shielded his eyes, but the light burned through his eyelids, searing into his mind. When he opened his eyes again, he was standing in a different room. The basement was gone. He was in what appeared to be a study, filled with books and old furniture. The air was thick with the scent of dust and decay. On the desk in front of him was an open journal. The handwriting was the same as the one he'd found earlier, Annalisa's. He flipped through the pages, his hands shaking. April 3rd, 1928. Asterisk, Father says the basement is the key. He won't tell me what's down there, but I hear it sometimes at night. The thudding. The scratching. He says it must never be opened, but I'm scared. What if it gets out? Asterisk. April 12th, 1928. Asterisk, it got out. Asterisk. The final entry was smudged with what looked like dried blood, but one sentence was still legible. Asterisk, the watcher cannot be stopped. Asterisk. A sudden knock at the door made him jump. Elliot spun around, his heart racing. The door to the study creaked open on its own, revealing a long, dimly lit hallway. Elliot, the boy's voice called, faint and echoing. He stepped into the hallway, drawn forward despite his fear. The walls were lined with portraits of people he didn't recognize, their eyes following him as he moved. At the end of the hallway was another door. This one wasn't old or decayed like the rest of the house. It was pristine, its surface gleaming, and carved into the wood was a single word. Escape. Elliot's hand hovered over the doorknob. Could it really be that simple? But before he could open it, the house shook violently, a deafening roar erupting from the basement below. The floor beneath him cracked and buckled, and the hallway twisted and warped as though the house itself were alive. The voice came again, louder this time, filled with rage. Asterisk, you cannot leave. Asterisk. Elliot was thrown to the ground as the floor gave way beneath him, plunging him into darkness once more. He landed hard, the air knocked out of his lungs. When he opened his eyes, he was back in the basement, lying next to the trapdoor. The glow was gone and the room was silent. But the symbols on the trapdoor were different now. They were no longer glowing, they were burned into the wood, smoldering faintly. And in the center of the trapdoor, carved deeply into the wood, was a single word. Stay. Elliot sat on the basement floor, his breath ragged, staring at the word stay carved into the trapdoor. The silence was oppressive, almost sentient, pressing down on him with an unseen force. But he couldn't stay. The house was alive and it didn't just want him, it needed him. The boy's warnings echoed in his mind, it's awake now. Elliot forced himself to his feet, his legs trembling. He stumbled up the stairs, avoiding the shadows that seemed to creep closer, reaching for him. His only thought was to get away from the basement, from the thing that had clawed at the edges of his sanity. But when he reached the first floor, his relief was short-lived. The house had changed. The hallway leading to the front door was gone, replaced by a single staircase spiraling upward. The walls were warped and twisted, the wooden boards buckling like something massive had pressed against them. At the top of the staircase was a door, the attic. Elliot's chest tightened as he stared up at the door. He didn't want to go up there, but it was the only way forward. The house groaned, its protests vibrating through the floorboards. It wanted him to go, almost as if guiding him toward something it desperately needed him to see. He climbed the staircase, each step heavier than the last. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping with every inch he ascended. When he reached the attic door, he hesitated. The rusted key he'd found earlier felt like a weight in his pocket. Elliot pulled it out and slid it into the lock. The door creaked open, revealing the attic bathed in an unnatural, dim light. The space was larger than it should have been, impossibly vast, as though the house had stretched itself to accommodate whatever secrets it held. The wooden beams above were shrouded in thick cobwebs, and the air smelled of decay and mold. In the center of the room was a single object, a tall, ornate mirror, its silver frame intricately carved with symbols that matched those on the trapdoor. Elliot approached cautiously. The surface of the mirror shimmered like liquid, its reflection distorted and wrong. When he stood before it, his image wavered, rippling as though it were a pond disturbed by a stone. He raised his hand and his reflection did the same, but a moment too late. Elliot's breath caught in his throat. "Who are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. His reflection smiled. "I am you," it said, its voice warped and layered like a chorus of whispers. Elliot staggered back, but the reflection didn't follow. It remained in the mirror, watching him with an unnatural intensity. "No, you're not," Elliot said, his voice shaking. "What is this place? What do you want from me?" The reflection tilted its head, its smile widening. "You already know." The mirror began to shimmer more violently, the surface bubbling and twisting. Elliot stumbled backward as a figure emerged from the glass. A tall, thin silhouette with unnaturally long limbs and hollow, glowing eyes. Was the Watcher. The room darkened as the creature stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. The floor groaned beneath its weight, though it seemed to hover just above the ground. "You cannot escape," the Watcher said, its voice resonating like a deep drumbeat in Elliot's chest. "You are bound to this place, to me." Elliot backed away, his heart hammering. "I don't understand. Why me? What do you want?" The Watcher paused, its hollow eyes burning brighter. "Your family made a pact," it said, each word dripping with malice. "They bound themselves to the house, to me. You are the last of their line. The tether must hold." Elliot shook his head. "No, I didn't agree to anything. This has nothing to do with me." The Watcher's voice grew colder, sharper. "It has everything to do with you. Blood calls to blood. You cannot break the chain." The mirror behind the Watcher began to glow, its surface swirling with images. Elliot's heart sank as he saw his childhood home, his mother's face, his father's distant stare. The images shifted to the cemetery, the graves bearing his family's names, and finally to the trapdoor in the basement. "Their souls are mine," the Watcher said, its voice a low growl. "Yours will be too." Elliot felt a surge of anger and fear. "No," he said through gritted teeth. "You won't take me." The Watcher extended a clawed hand toward him, and the room trembled. Shadows writhed along the walls, stretching and twisting toward Elliot like living things. In a panic, he grabbed the only weapon he could find, a rusted candlestick lying on a nearby table, and swung it at the mirror. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, and the room was plunged into chaos. The watcher let out an ear-piercing shriek, its form flickering and distorting. The shadows recoiled, writhing in agony as the mirror's shards scattered across the floor. Elliot didn't wait to see what would happen next. He bolted for the attic door, the house shaking violently around him. The staircase seemed endless as he descended, each step stretching further than the last. The walls closed in, the air growing thicker, suffocating. When he finally reached the first floor, the front door was back, its frame glowing faintly with an otherworldly light. Freedom. Elliot ran for the door, but just as he reached for the handle, a force yanked him backward. The watcher's voice echoed in his mind, louder and more furious than ever. Asterisk, you cannot leave. Asterisk. The shadows surged toward him, engulfing him in darkness. Elliot screamed, his voice lost in the cacophony of the house's groans and the watcher's rage. Then everything went silent. Elliot opened his eyes and found himself outside, standing on the overgrown lawn of Grimwood House. The fog had lifted, and the morning sun bathed the house in a golden light, making it look almost peaceful. He turned to look at the front door, but it was gone. The windows were dark, and the house seemed abandoned, as though it had been that way for years. Elliot's hand trembled as he reached into his pocket, pulling out the rusted key. It was still there, cold and heavy in his palm. The faintest sound reached his ears, a low rhythmic thudding coming from deep within the house. Elliot backed away, his heart racing. He didn't look back as he ran down the driveway, the weight of the key in his pocket a reminder that the house wasn't finished with him. Elliot didn't stop running until his legs gave out. By the time he collapsed, the sun was high in the sky, but it offered no warmth. The chill from Grimwood House clung to him, like a shadow he couldn't shake. He sat on the edge of a clearing, his chest heaving as he tried to catch his breath. Around him, the woods were eerily silent. No birdsong, no rustling leaves, only the faint whisper of the wind. He glanced back the way he'd come, half expecting to see the house looming behind him, but it was gone. The narrow dirt path he'd followed had vanished, leaving only an impenetrable wall of trees. "Where am I?" he whispered to himself. The key in his pocket seemed to grow heavier, as though mocking him. He pulled it out, the rusted surface glinting faintly in the light. He wanted to throw it away, to leave everything about the house behind, but something stopped him. A voice. It was faint at first, barely more than a murmur carried on the wind. "Elliot." He froze, his blood running cold. "Who's there?" he called, his voice trembling. The woods didn't answer. The voice came again, clearer this time. It wasn't the guttural snarl of the watcher or the boy's frightened whispers. It was familiar, painfully so. "Elliot, come here." His breath hitched. It was his mother's voice. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's not possible." But the voice persisted, beckoning him deeper into the woods. "Please, Elliot. I need you." Against his better judgment, Elliot rose to his feet, his legs unsteady. The voice tugged at something deep inside him, a primal need to believe it was real. He followed the sound, weaving through the dense trees. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly, the light dimming as though the sun itself was retreating. The voice grew louder, more insistent. "Elliot, this way." He stumbled into another clearing, smaller and darker than the last. In the center was an old well, its stones covered in moss and vines. The voice was coming from below. Elliot approached cautiously, peering into the well's shadowy depths. The darkness seemed alive, swirling like a living thing. "Help me," the voice said, softer now, pleading. He gripped the edge of the well, leaning closer. "Mom," he whispered. A hand shot out of the darkness, pale and clawed, grabbing his wrist. Elliot screamed, pulling back with all his strength, but the hand held fast. It was cold, impossibly strong, and its grip burned like ice. "Stay," the voice hissed, its tone shifting into something monstrous. Elliot's free hand scrambled for something, anything, to defend himself. His fingers closed around a loose stone from the well's edge, and he swung it with all his might. The hand released him, retreating into the shadows with an inhuman shriek. Elliot stumbled back, clutching his wrist. The skin where the hand had grabbed him was red and raw, the same strange symbols burned into his flesh. The well was silent again, but he didn't wait to see if the hand would return. He turned and ran, the trees blurring past him. As he ran, the forest seemed to close in around him. The trees twisted unnaturally, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The ground beneath him grew uneven, the roots rising to trip him. And the voices followed. They weren't just his mother's anymore. They were countless, overlapping and echoing, calling his name, laughing, crying, screaming. Elliot, you can't run. Come back. It's not over. His lungs burned, his legs screaming in protest, but he didn't stop. He didn't know where he was going, he just needed to get away. Finally, he broke through the trees and stumbled onto a dirt road. The sudden openness was jarring, the sky above overcast and gray. He collapsed to his knees, gasping for air. The voices faded, replaced by the faint rustle of leaves in the breeze. For a moment he thought he was safe, but then he heard the sound of footsteps behind him. Elliot turned, his heart racing. A figure emerged from the woods, a young boy, his face pale and his clothes tattered. It was the same boy he'd seen in the house. You shouldn't have left, the boy said, his voice barely above a whisper. Elliot scrambled to his feet, backing away. What do you want from me? What is this place? The boy's eyes were hollow, his expression unreadable. It's not about what I want. It's about what it wants. The Watcher, Elliot said, his voice shaking. The boy nodded. It's bound to the house, but the house isn't just there. It's everywhere. It's in the woods, in the air. It's in you now. Elliot shook his head. No, I got out. I broke the mirror. The boy's gaze darkened. You didn't break anything. You only woke it up. The boy stepped closer, his voice urgent. You can still end this, but you have to go back. You have to seal the door. Elliot stared at him, incredulous. Seal it? Oh, with what? The boy reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, a shard of the mirror, its surface glinting with an unnatural light. Take this, he said, holding it out. It's the only way. Elliot hesitated, his mind racing. The shard seemed to pulse in the boy's hand, radiating a cold energy. And if I don't? He asked. The boy's expression hardened. Then it will take you. And everything else. Elliot reached out and took the shard. The moment his fingers touched it, a searing pain shot through his hand, and the symbols on his arm burned brighter. The boy stepped back, his form beginning to fade. Follow the voices, he said. They'll lead you back. Before Elliot could respond, the boy vanished, leaving him alone on the dirt road. The forest loomed on either side, dark and menacing. The shard in his hand grew colder, almost pulling him toward the trees. And the voices began again, faint and distant, guiding him back to the nightmare he thought he'd escaped. Elliot stood in the middle of the attic, his breath shallow as his heart pounded in his chest. The door, which had once trapped him in this cursed space, was now open, but the weight of the house seemed heavier than ever. The stale air felt thick, pressing against his lungs like something alive. It was as if the manor was feeding off his fear, growing stronger with every passing second. His arm, still marked with the strange symbol that had appeared overnight, pulsed faintly. It had spread over the past few hours, the lines twisting into more intricate patterns that seemed to be following a path of their own. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Whatever this curse was, it was changing him. He had always been skeptical of the supernatural, but now the evidence was right there on his skin. The attic was silent except for the occasional creak of the old beams above him, but the silence felt too deliberate. The house was waiting for something. Elliot took a shaky step forward, examining the artifacts scattered across the attic floor. His hand brushed against a cracked doll with empty eyes, its porcelain face chipped and hollow. It was one of the many unsettling relics left behind by those who had come before him. Turning his attention to the old journal he had found earlier, he leafed through its pages, his fingers tracing the cryptic symbols. One page in particular caught his eye, a hastily scrawled note that read, Asterisk, only blood can bind the Watcher. Asterisk. He recoiled, his stomach turning. What? What did that mean? Was this some kind of ritual? The thought of cutting himself, or worse, offering something else, felt like crossing a line he wasn't ready to cross. But the whispers in his mind, those strange, insistent voices, urged him forward. A cold gust of air swept through the attic, chilling him to the bone. The wind howled through the cracks in the walls, and for a moment, Elliot thought he heard something, someone, moving behind him. His pulse quickened. He spun around, but the room was empty. Just the shadows stretching unnaturally across the floor. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut behind him with a deafening bang. Elliot froze, his heart leaping in his throat. The house was toying with him. It always had been. The shadows seemed to shift as if alive, crawling up the walls, twisting in ways that defied logic. He could almost hear something breathing just beyond his reach, something watching him from the corners of the room. Then the footsteps began. Slow, methodical. Each step came closer, echoing through the space, but Elliot was alone. The cold, unsettling air around him grew heavier, and the sound of the footsteps grew louder, until they were right behind him. He whirled around again, but there was nothing. No one. Just the same oppressive darkness pressing in on him from all sides. Then a voice, deep and guttural, whispered in his ear. It's too late. Elliot staggered back, panic rising in his chest as the air seemed to close in on him. The mark on his arm burned, and for a moment he thought he could see something. No, someone, in the shadows, their features just out of sight, watching him with dark, malevolent eyes. He had to get out. He had to find a way to stop this, before whatever was hunting him claimed him too. But as he rushed for the door, it wouldn't budge. It was as if the house itself had locked him in. The whispers grew louder, the shadows thickened, and the footsteps echoed all around him. And then, just when Elliot thought he couldn't take it any longer, the door creaked open. But what he saw on the other side made his blood run cold. The hallway was empty, but the shadows that stretched across the floor seemed to move in ways they shouldn't have. As if the walls themselves were alive, breathing, shifting. Elliot took a hesitant step forward, but then something caught his eye. A figure, a dark silhouette, standing at the end of the hallway. It was tall, impossibly tall, its limbs elongated and unnatural, its face hidden in shadow. The Watcher. He froze, unable to move. It knew he was here. It had always known. The figure raised a hand, a long, twisted finger pointing directly at him. You can never leave, the voice whispered, and Elliot's blood ran cold. With a final, trembling step backward, Elliot's feet hit the edge of the attic floor, and the world seemed to tilt. The shadows closed in on him, and for a moment, everything went black. As the darkness consumes him, Elliot feels a burning sensation on his arm. The mark begins to writhe as if alive, and the last thing he hears is the sound of a child's laughter echoing in the distance. Elliot awoke with a start, gasping for air, his heart hammering in his chest. His head spun as though he had been pulled from a deep, unsettling dream, but the reality around him was no better. The attic was empty, bathed in a faint, eerie light that seemed to come from nowhere. The oppressive air that had once seemed so alive had thickened into something darker. He could feel it pressing against his skin, suffocating him. His arm, it felt like it was on fire. Elliot's eyes darted down to the mark that had burned into his skin, now visibly pulsating, spreading further. The intricate symbols were crawling over his forearm like living things, twisting and shifting, impossibly organic. The strange glyphs seemed to hum, resonating in his very bones, and the pain, sharp, hot, like something had been carved into his flesh, was unbearable. He stumbled to his feet, barely able to steady himself, his mind racing. The Watcher, the whispers, the warning in the attic. It all felt like a fever dream, but it was real. Too real. The house had changed. He could feel it in every breath he took, in every creak of the floorboards beneath his feet. It was as though the walls were closing in on him, watching, waiting. He needed to leave, needed to get out before whatever had been chasing him finally caught up. But there was nowhere to run. His legs felt heavy as he staggered toward the door, but just as his hand touched the doorknob, an overwhelming sensation washed over him. A flood of memories that weren't his own. They rushed in, one after the other, chaotic flashes of past horrors. He saw himself, a child, running through the house, terrified, lost in the dark. The oppressive shadows. The whispers. The man, no, the thing, with eyes like burning coals, standing at the end of the hall. He saw his parents' faces, twisted in pain and fear, their mouths open in silent screams as they were consumed by the house. And then the pale woman. Her face was hauntingly familiar. Her eyes, dark, empty, stared back at him from the depths of his memories. Her mouth didn't move, but he could hear her voice in his mind, echoing, saying his name, calling him back. It's time to claim what is yours. Elliot's breath caught in his throat as the memory, no, the vision, faded. He blinked hard, trying to focus, but the darkness in the corners of his vision had only grown stronger. The mark on his arm burned with renewed intensity, spreading up toward his shoulder like a creeping vine. He needed answers. With his pulse pounding in his ears, Elliot made his way down the stairs, each step feeling like it could be his last. The house was alive. He could feel it, the weight of its presence pressing down on him. It had been waiting for him. The whispers, the shadows, the memories, it was all part of a web, a trap that had been set long ago. As he reached the main floor, the hallway stretched before him, dark and silent. His eyes landed on the basement door, cracked open just enough to reveal the dim, musty interior. There was something down there, something the house had been hiding. He could feel it in his bones, the pull, the connection. Go to the basement. The thought echoed in his mind, and for a moment he fought it. But the house had already claimed him. He had no choice but to follow. The air grew colder as he approached the basement door. His hand trembled as he reached for the handle, but before he could open it fully, the floorboards creaked behind him. Elliot whipped around, his breath catching in his throat. The figure was there again, standing at the far end of the hallway. The tall, distorted silhouette of the Watcher. It stood motionless, watching him. But now, the figure's form seemed to shift, its limbs elongating, its head tilting at an unnatural angle as if it were studying him. Elliot's heart raced. He couldn't move. The figure's eyes, those burning, hollow eyes, seemed to pierce through him, stripping away his resolve, his will. "Your blood is already here," the voice came again, deeper this time, resonating in his skull. It was a voice that belonged to the house, to the shadows, to the very thing that had been following him for as long as he could remember. Asterisk, "You've always belonged to it." Asterisk. The words hit him like a punch to the gut, leaving him breathless. Belong to it, he didn't understand. What did it mean? What was the Watcher talking about? But before he could process anything further, a sharp, jagged pain shot through his arm. The mark, whatever it was, asterisk, twisted asterisk, its edges now sharp and burning as though it were searing itself into his flesh. Without thinking, Elliot screamed, stumbling backward toward the basement door. The shadow of the Watcher seemed to stretch, growing larger, its presence swallowing the hallway around him. The door creaked open of its own accord, beckoning him into the darkness below. He had no choice. He could hear the whispers now, his asterisk whispers, his voice telling him to descend. The house had been calling him for years. As he took his first step toward the basement, the shadows behind him seemed to move in sync with him. A cold laugh, distant yet unmistakable, echoed through the halls. The Watcher was waiting. Elliot's foot steps onto the first stair, and the house trembles violently. A low, guttural growl fills the air as the shadows coil around him. The basement seems to be calling, but it's no longer just the house. Something else has awoken, and it's coming for him. Elliot's breath came in ragged gasps as he descended the basement stairs, the darkness swallowing him whole. The house seemed to groan in protest with each step, the walls shifting and creaking as if trying to pull him back. His body was moving on its own, guided by an unseen force, his legs heavy as though the very weight of the manor was pressing him down. The cold air grew thicker, and with it came the unmistakable stench of decay, of old blood and forgotten rituals. The shadows twisted around him, writhing like snakes, their shapes dancing just beyond the edge of his vision. His arm burned with an unbearable intensity, the mark on his skin now a seething mass of black veins. It felt as though the curse was taking root within him, claiming his very essence. He could almost hear it, the entity's whispering promises, asterisk, come closer. It's waiting, asterisk, and so he did. Each step drew him further into the heart of the house, until the stairs ended in a small, narrow hallway. A low hum filled the air, vibrating through his bones. He could feel the pulse of something ancient and malignant, a presence far older than anything he had imagined. The door at the end of the hallway stood ajar, beckoning him in. Elliot didn't even question it. He reached out, his hand trembling, and pushed it open. The room beyond was dimly lit, the only light coming from a single flickering candle set atop a blood-stained altar. The air was thick with a rancid metallic tang, and the walls were adorned with dark symbols, runes that pulsed with a faint, sickly glow. They seemed to move as he looked at them, shifting and rearranging themselves like the very fabric of reality was being manipulated. In the center of the room, a large stone slab stood at the altar, its surface slick with something that resembled old blood. Strange carvings were etched into the stone, some in the same symbols from the journal, others completely alien, as though they had been designed for something far more sinister. Elliot's mind reeled. This was it, the heart of the ritual, the place where it all began. And there, lying at the altar, was a photograph, a faded, yellowed picture of a child standing with the same pale woman he had seen in his memories. But this time he could make out the face of the child. It was him. A younger version of himself, standing in front of the same altar, dressed in the same old clothes, his eyes wide with terror. He staggered back, his mind racing. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be happening. But the whispers grew louder, his asterisk whispers, urging him forward, pulling him closer to the altar. Before he could make sense of it all, his eyes caught something even more terrifying. A shadow, deep and unnatural, began to form in the corner of the room. The air grew colder, the shadows thicker. The darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own. A figure began to emerge from the corner, tall, thin, its limbs stretched unnaturally long. Its face was hidden in shadow, but its presence was undeniable. It was the Watcher. The air around Elliot seemed to freeze. He could feel the weight of its gaze, cold and predatory, bearing down on him. It didn't move, it didn't need to. It was everywhere at once. "You shouldn't have come," the voice echoed through the room, its tone deep and guttural, like 1,000 whispers all speaking in unison. "You are too late. The pact has already been made." Elliot's heart raced, panic rising in his chest. He couldn't move. He couldn't breathe. The Watcher was everywhere, its presence suffocating. The house itself seemed to grow more oppressive, more alive, as though it were feeding off the fear emanating from him. He turned back to the altar, searching for some kind of answer. The photograph, his photograph, seemed to mock him, a sick reminder of his family's connection to this place, to this curse. A terrible realization washed over him. The Watcher wasn't just a part of the house. It was the house. It had been here long before him, and it would remain long after he was gone. The ritual, was meant to trap it. But in his bloodline's desperation, in their attempt to control the darkness, they had done the opposite. They had set it free. And now Elliot was the final key. "It's time to finish what they started," the voice whispered, now right behind him, its breath cold against his ear. Only blood can bind the Watcher. Elliot's pulse thundered in his ears. The room seemed to collapse in on him, the shadows closing in, the air suffocating. His arm burned as the mark glowed brighter, its twisted symbols pulsing with malevolent energy. He had to act. He had to do something before it was too late. But as he turned to face the Watcher, he saw something in its eyes, something that wasn't quite there before. A flicker of recognition. The Watcher was smiling. And in that moment, Elliot realized the truth. He had never been meant to stop it. He was the vessel. The Watcher had been waiting for him all along. The shadows of the room begin to warp, stretching toward Elliot. The mark on his arm flares painfully as the room itself shifts. The Watcher raises its hand, and the walls tremble as an unearthly force begins to surge. The world around Elliot seemed to collapse in slow motion, the room warping as though reality itself was unspooling. Shadows swarmed toward him, tendrils of darkness reaching out with a mind of their own, grabbing at his legs, his arms, pulling him deeper into the nightmare. The Watcher's roar reverberated through his skull, a deafening cry that echoed in his bones. "You cannot break the cycle." The Watcher's voice boomed, a mix of fury and terror. The air grew thick, oppressive, like the weight of the house itself was pressing down on him, suffocating him. But Elliot stood firm. The shard of glass was in his hand, its jagged edges cutting into his skin, blood dripping from his fingers as he held it high, his heart thundering in his chest. The pain in his arm, the burn of the mark, only fueled his resolve. He was no longer a puppet, no longer bound by the dark legacy of his bloodline. He had a choice. With a primal yell, Elliot plunged the glass shard into the altar. The impact sent a shockwave of energy through the room, shaking the very foundation of Grimwood House. The walls trembled as the shadows recoiled, a pulse of light flashing from the altar as though the house itself was being torn apart. For a brief, fleeting moment, the house seemed to hold its breath. But the Watcher did not relent. It surged forward, its grotesque form growing larger, its eyes now ablaze with a primal fury. "Fool!" The Watcher hissed. "You think you can destroy me? You think you can destroy what has existed for centuries?" Elliot's knees buckled, the weight of the house crashing into him like a tidal wave. His breath came in short, ragged gasps. He felt his body weakening, the mark on his arm burning hotter with every second. But as the darkness closed in, he saw it. The ritual, the final piece of the puzzle. The very thing that had trapped the Watcher all this time. What? His blood. The Watcher had been trapped for centuries not because of the house, but because of the bloodline. The curse had always been about power, the power to contain it, to control it. And now the power was his. Elliot's mind raced. He had one last chance. One last choice. He could end it all. But it would come at a cost. The shadows writhed around him, pulling at him like hungry hands, but Elliot fought them back. He gritted his teeth, focusing on the heart of the ritual, the truth that had always been there, hidden beneath layers of lies and pain. His blood, the blood of his ancestors, was the key. "You will be mine, Elliot Grayson," the Watcher taunted, its voice a low growl, the room shaking violently as the house screamed in agony. "You belong to me." But Elliot's eyes narrowed, his grip tightening on the shard of glass. He took a deep breath, his pulse steadying. The energy from the altar surged through him, filling him with a terrible clarity. The Watcher's words, its threats, were nothing more than echoes of the past. The curse could end. The cycle could break. With a final, desperate cry, Elliot thrust the shard into the heart of the altar, his own blood pouring freely into the cracks. The room erupted in a blinding light, the walls and floor shaking violently as the house began to crumble around him. The Watcher screamed in rage, its form flickering, distorting as the light surged toward it like a tidal wave. The light consumed everything. And then, silence. Elliot awoke in the wreckage of Grimwood House, the air thick with dust and decay. His body felt like it had been torn apart, but he could still feel the weight of the mark on his arm, now glowing faintly, its presence still there. He could hear the wind howling outside, the forest that surrounded the manor still alive with its whispers. But the house was gone. The Watcher was gone. The curse had been broken. Or so he thought. Elliot staggered to his feet, his legs unsteady. He looked around at the ruins of the manor, the shattered walls, the collapsed ceiling. It was over. He had survived. Or had he? The mark on his arm burned once more, a sharp pain that brought him to his knees. He gasped, clutching his arm as the world around him seemed to pulse with life. The house was gone, but its presence lingered, like an echo in the air. And then in the distance he heard it, a faint sound like the soft giggle of a child. Elliot's blood ran cold. It was faint but unmistakable. The cycle had not ended. The sound grew louder, closer. A child's laughter, light and carefree, echoed in the wind. And in that moment, Elliot understood. He had defeated the Watcher, but it was never just about the Watcher. The house, the curse, the bloodline, they were all part of a cycle. A cycle that, no matter how many times it was broken, would always return. Elliot stood, staring at the horizon, his heart heavy with the knowledge that Grimwood House, its curse, and the Watcher would always be a part of him. The price of survival had been steep. His memories, his identity, were slipping away, and in their place was an eerie emptiness. As he turned to leave, the sound of a car approaching caught his attention. A new family had arrived. The cycle was beginning again. And as they stepped into the ruins of Grimwood House, Elliot could only watch from the shadows, knowing that they, too, would one day face the horrors he had endured. The Watcher was still out there, waiting. Story 3. Rain lashed against the windshield like angry fingers, and Jamie squinted through the fogged-up glass, cursing the broken GPS. The faint green glow of the dashboard clock read 11:47 p.m., and the rhythmic thrum of the wipers only made the silence more oppressive. There wasn't another car for miles, just a winding road hemmed in by towering pines that seemed to lean closer with every turn. Great, Jamie muttered, smacking the GPS. The screen flickered and died, leaving them alone with the road and the storm. The map had promised a main highway leading to town, but this back road was anything but well-traveled. It felt forgotten, lost in time, much like the ominous place it seemed to be leading. A break in the trees revealed a silhouette ahead, a house, massive and skeletal against the night sky. Its windows were dark hollows, and its peaked roof jutted into the air like a jagged crown. Lightning streaked across the sky, illuminating the faded sign at the entrance, Blackwood House. Jamie's stomach sank. Every nerve screamed to turn back, but the storm had made the road nearly impassable. They were tired, soaked, and desperate for shelter. The driveway was long, cracked with weeds sprouting through the asphalt. The headlights swept over a pair of wrought iron gates standing ajar. As Jamie drove through, the gates groaned on their hinges as if protesting their intrusion. The car rolled to a stop in front of the house. For a moment, Jamie just sat there, hands gripping the steering wheel, heart thudding. The storm made it impossible to see much, but even in the dim light, the mansion seemed alive, watching. "This is temporary," Jamie whispered, grabbing their backpack. "Just until the storm lets up." The front porch creaked under Jamie's weight as they climbed the steps. The door, tall and warped with age, loomed in front of them. A brass knocker, shaped like a wolf's head, gleamed faintly in the rain. When they lifted it, a low growl seemed to echo from the metal before the sound of the knock reverberated through the house. They waited. Nothing. "Hello?" Jamie called, but their voice sounded small, swallowed by the storm. With a tentative push, the door swung open. The hinges screamed, and the smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic wafted out. Jamie hesitated, but the wind picked up, driving icy rain against their back. Steeling their nerves, they stepped inside and shut the door. The silence was immediate. The storm seemed to vanish, replaced by the muffled stillness of the house. Jamie flicked on the flashlight from their phone, sweeping the beam across the foyer. Dust coated every surface. A grand staircase spiraled upward into the dark, flanked by peeling wallpaper and tarnished chandeliers. Faint shapes hung on the walls, portraits, though the faces were obscured by grime and shadow. Something shifted. A soft creak, as if someone had just stepped onto an unseen floorboard. "Hello?" Jamie called again, their voice trembling slightly. Only silence answered. The first room Jamie explored was a parlor, its furniture draped in white sheets like forgotten ghosts. A fireless hearth dominated one wall, the mantel above it lined with cracked vases and faded photographs. Jamie moved closer, brushing dust from one of the frames. It was a family, a man, woman, and 2 children, standing stiffly in front of the very house Jamie now stood in. Their expressions were hollow, smiles forced. The woman's hand rested on one of the children's shoulders, but the boy's face was scratched out, leaving only a blank void. Jamie shuddered, placing the frame back carefully. Another sound broke the silence, a soft thump, coming from deeper within the house. The hallway stretched on forever, or so it seemed. Each door Jamie passed felt like it was hiding something, and the air grew colder with every step. At the end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar. Light spilled out in a thin line across the floor. Jamie's pulse quickened. They pushed the door open slowly, revealing a small room that seemed untouched by time. A rocking chair sat by a window, gently swaying though there was no breeze. On the floor was a trail of muddy footprints, leading from the door to the chair. Jamie froze. The prints weren't old, they were fresh, the mud still glistening. The chair stopped rocking. Jamie's breath caught as a shadow shifted in the corner of the room, just at the edge of the light. Jamie's phone buzzed suddenly, the vibration startling in the oppressive silence. They glanced down at the screen. A message. "Get out." When they looked back up, the shadow was gone. The phone slipped from Jamie's trembling hand, clattering to the floor. The text glared up at them, the words pulsating in their mind. "Get out." A cold draft swept through the room, snuffing out the light from the hallway behind them. Jamie's breath came in short bursts, their heartbeat hammering against their ribs. They reached for the phone, hands shaking, and turned on the flashlight again. The beam flickered, threatening to die. The shadow was gone, but the footprints remained, leading toward the window. Jamie moved closer, reluctant but unable to stop themselves. The rain outside had turned to a steady drumming, the world beyond the glass an endless curtain of water. The rocking chair sat still now, an eerie calm settling over the room. Jamie's mind raced, searching for some explanation, something rational. "Old house," they muttered under their breath. "Creaky floors. Drafty windows. That's all." But the words felt hollow. The phone buzzed again, startling Jamie. This time the message was different. Downstairs. The light from the screen flickered, and before Jamie could react, the phone screen turned black. No amount of button pressing brought it back to life. Jamie backed out of the room, clutching the useless device like a talisman. As they stepped into the hallway, they noticed something new, the faint sound of a piano. The melody was uneven, haunting, a child plinking out a tune by memory. It came from the parlor they had passed earlier. Jamie hesitated, every instinct screaming to leave, but the sound was hypnotic. It called to them, pulling them forward step by step. The parlor was darker than before. Shadows pooled in the corners, defying the weak glow of Jamie's flashlight. The sheet covering the piano had been pulled aside, revealing its polished black surface. A single key pressed down, the note ringing out sharp and clear. Jamie's flashlight swept over the piano bench. It was empty. They turned to leave, but a faint whisper cut through the air, freezing them in place. "Stay with us." Their flashlight blinked once, twice, and then died completely. Darkness swallowed the room whole. ####Chapter 2, The House's Whisper, continued. Jamie fumbled in the darkness, their breath quickening. The parlor felt suffocating now, the air heavy and damp. Their eyes strained against the black, searching for anything, a faint outline, a glimmer of light, but there was nothing. The piano played again, louder this time, each note jarring and wrong, like a scream trapped in melody. Jamie stumbled backward, colliding with something solid. A table? A chair? No, it felt warmer, almost soft like skin. A sharp intake of breath, not Jamie's own, hissed just behind their ear. Jamie bolted from the room, crashing into the hallway. The faint whisper followed, insistent and mocking. Stay with us." The hallway stretched impossibly long now, its walls narrowing, pressing in. Jamie ran, desperate for the door they'd come through, but the house seemed to twist around them, pulling them deeper into its grasp. They stopped at the base of the grand staircase, their chest heaving. Above, on the second floor landing, stood a figure. It was too dark to see clearly, but its outline was unmistakable, tall, thin, and unnaturally still. Jamie froze, clutching the banister, unable to look away. The figure tilted its head slowly as though studying them. Then it raised one bony hand and pointed toward the basement door. The message on the phone came rushing back. Downstairs? Jamie shook their head, stepping back. No way. The figure took a step forward. The air grew colder, the room shrinking around them. The door to the basement creaked open on its own. Jamie's feet refused to move, rooted to the floor as the basement door gaped open like a mouth waiting to swallow them whole. The figure on the landing remained frozen, its presence heavier than the darkness itself. The air in the house seemed to shift, a low, resonant hum filling the silence. It vibrated in Jamie's chest, pulling them closer to the open doorway. No, Jamie whispered, their voice trembling. I'm not going down there. The whisper returned, coiling around their ears like smoke. Come closer. The figure on the landing took another step forward. This time, Jamie could see its eyes, pale and luminous, shining like tiny moons in the dark. Panic surged through them, breaking their paralysis. They bolted for the door, the one they'd entered through earlier. The doorknob rattled uselessly in their grip. What? Come on. Jamie hissed, yanking and pounding on the wood. The storm still raged outside, but it was distant now, muffled, as though the house had swallowed the sound. Behind them, the basement door creaked wider. A smell drifted out, wet earth, rot, and something metallic. Jamie's stomach turned as the whisper grew louder. Jamie? Hearing their name was like ice water down their spine. They spun around, clutching their useless phone like a weapon. The figure was gone. But the basement door was no longer empty. A shape emerged from the shadows, crawling on all fours. Its limbs were too long, its movements jerky like a marionette with tangled strings. Its head tilted unnaturally, the neck cracking audibly with each motion. Jamie stumbled backward, their back hitting the locked front door. The thing stopped at the base of the stairs, its head lowering as though sniffing the air. Then it whispered again, a guttural rasp. Come home. Without thinking, Jamie lunged for the staircase, taking the steps two at a time. The second floor might be a trap, but it was better than whatever waited below. Their foot slipped on the last step, and they fell hard, scraping their knee on the splintered wood. Pain shot through their leg, but they scrambled forward, crawling into the upper hallway. The whisper was closer now, accompanied by the sound of scraping, nails or claws dragging across the banister. Jamie crawled into the first room they found, slamming the door shut behind them. The lock clicked into place, though the thin wood felt like no barrier at all. The room was a bedroom, its furniture draped in the same ghostly sheets as the parlor. A cracked mirror leaned against one wall, reflecting the faint glow of moonlight filtering through the curtains. Jamie backed away from the door, clutching their injured leg. The whispers had stopped, but the silence was worse. Then the mirror moved. Not the frame. No, the glass itself rippled like water disturbed by a stone. Jamie stared, unable to look away as an image took shape within the surface. It was the basement door. Open wider now, revealing a set of stairs spiraling down into the dark. Something was waiting at the bottom. Something too large, its outline jagged and wrong. Jamie's reflection in the mirror twisted, their face stretching into a scream that didn't come from their own mouth. The door behind them rattled violently, the sound shattering the stillness. They turned, their heart lurching into their throat, as a voice whispered through the wood, low and almost sing-song. Jamie, we've been waiting. Jamie pressed their back against the wall, their breath shallow and ragged. The door shuddered again, the handle twisting as though someone, or something, on the other side was trying to force its way in. Their mind raced, desperate for an escape. The window. It was old, but maybe it could open. They crawled toward it, ignoring the sharp pain in their knee. The storm outside raged harder, wind howling like a wounded animal, but freedom was freedom. The door stopped rattling. Jamie froze, their hand hovering over the window latch. The silence on the other side was deafening, an absence so profound it made the hairs on their necks stand on end. And then the whisper returned. You can't leave, Jamie. Not yet. They spun around, their eyes darting across the room. It sounded closer now, as if it had slithered inside, curling around the walls. The mirror rippled again. This time, the image it showed wasn't the basement. It was a memory. Jamie saw themselves as a child, no older than 8, standing in front of a different house. A modest 2-story home with a wide porch. They were holding a balloon, their cheeks streaked with tears. Behind them stood 2 figures, their parents arguing heatedly. The memory shifted, the edges darkening like a photo burning from the outside in. The scene zoomed in on the balloon in their hand, its red surface distorting. Words appeared on it, scrawled in thick black letters. "You forgot." Jamie stumbled backward, the mirror's glow casting long, distorted shadows across the room. "No," they whispered, shaking their head. "This isn't real." The whisper coiled tighter, almost mocking. "But it is. You've always known." The room tilted suddenly, as though the floor had been yanked from under them. Jamie gripped the windowsill for balance, their vision swimming. When they looked back at the mirror, the image had changed again. It now showed the Blackwood house, but not as it was. This version was alive. Its windows glowed with warm light, and laughter echoed faintly. Figures moved inside, shadows flickering across the glass. Jamie's stomach twisted as the scene sharpened. The figures were a family, 2 parents, a boy and a girl. The girl looked just like Jamie. Their chests tightened, a flood of fragmented memories rushing back. Fragments they couldn't piece together. A birthday party. A fall. The sound of screaming. And then, nothing. The door exploded inward, slamming against the wall with a deafening crack. Jamie whipped around, their flashlight flickering weakly to life. Nothing was there. Just the yawning black of the hallway. But the air was colder now, thick with the metallic tang of blood. Jamie's flashlight beam quivered as they stepped toward the doorway, their pulse thundering in their ears. Something wet dripped onto their shoulder. They looked up. A face stared down at them from the ceiling, its features pale and bloated, its mouth stretched into a jagged, unnatural grin. Blackened fingers reached for Jamie as the whisper turned into a guttural roar. The air in the hallway felt alive, vibrating with something unseen. Jamie's chest heaved, their breaths shallow and quick as they stared into the darkness beyond the shattered door. A single thought repeated in their mind like a mantra: "Don't go to the basement." But the house had other plans. From deep below, a low, resonant thud echoed upward, vibrating through the floorboards. Jamie flinched, their flashlight trembling in their grip as its dim beam illuminated the door to the basement. It stood ajar now, gaping open like a wound. The staircase inside descended into impenetrable blackness, each step seeming to stretch and twist as though alive. The memory of the figure pointing toward the basement flashed through Jamie's mind. They shook their head, backing up, but their heel caught on a loose floorboard. The loud creak reverberated through the house, and for a brief moment, everything went still. Too still. Then, from the darkness, came the unmistakable sound of footsteps. Slow, deliberate, climbing the stairs from below. Jamie's heart slammed against their ribs. No, this isn't happening. The footsteps grew louder, accompanied by the soft scrape of something dragging against the wall. Suddenly, a child's voice echoed up the staircase, soft and sweet. "Jamie, is that you? Come play with me, ****. It was a voice they hadn't heard in years. Their little sister. The shock was a jolt to Jamie's system, their legs frozen as the voice called out again, a little louder this time. "Jamie, why did you leave me?" Tears stung Jamie's eyes, their breath catching in their throat. No, you're not real. You're not real." But the footsteps stopped, and the voice turned sharp, accusing. "You promised you'd come back for me." The hairs on Jamie's arms stood on end. They stepped back further, but the flashlight slipped from their shaking hand, its beam cutting across the floor before spinning to a stop. The light now pointed directly down the staircase. And there, halfway up, stood a figure. It wasn't a child. It was a woman, her face pale and bloated, her eyes dark pits that seemed to suck in the light. Her mouth hung open unnaturally wide, a low moan emanating from deep within her throat. Jamie scrambled backward, their hand fumbling for something, anything, to defend themselves. Their fingers closed around a heavy brass candlestick. The figure on the stairs tilted its head as though amused, and then it moved. Not walked. No, it crawled, its limbs contorting at impossible angles, joints cracking with each jerky motion. The dragging sound Jamie had heard before was now louder, the thing's nails scraping against the wall as it descended. Jamie screamed, lunging for the nearest door and slamming it shut behind them. They turned the lock, their hands shaking violently, and pressed their back against the wood. The silence on the other side was deafening. Jamie's breathing slowed, their pulse still pounding in their ears. They closed their eyes, whispering to themselves, "It's not real. It's not real." But then the doorknob began to twist. Jamie's eyes snapped open, their body frozen as the metal rattled violently. The thing outside wasn't trying to break the door down, it was playing with them, taunting. And then, just as suddenly as it started, it stopped. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. Jamie pressed their ear to the door, straining to hear anything. A single knock echoed from the other side. Jamie stumbled back, their heart in their throat. The knock came again, harder this time. The force of it made the doorframe shake. And then came the whisper, soft but clear, seeping through the wood like smoke. "You can't hide, Jamie." The lock clicked open on its own. Jamie backed away, clutching the candlestick tightly. The door swung inward, revealing an empty hallway. Or so it seemed. The basement door was fully open now, a faint glow emanating from below. It wasn't the comforting light of a bulb, it was pale and sickly, like the phosphorescent glow of something rotting deep underground. Jamie shook their head, whispering, "No, no, I'm not going down there." But their feet had other ideas. The same pull from earlier returned, stronger now, tugging at them with invisible hands. The candlestick fell from Jamie's grasp, clattering to the floor as they took one hesitant step, then another. Each creak of the floorboards was deafening, their body moving as though controlled by strings. The stairs were closer now, the glow brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat. Jamie gripped the banister, their knuckles white as they stared down into the abyss. The smell of damp earth and decay hit them in waves, making their stomach churn. The child's voice returned, softer now, pleading. "Don't leave me again, Jamie. Please, asterisk asterisk." Jamie's foot hovered over the first step. From below, a shadow shifted, stretching up the wall like smoke curling through the air. It wasn't the woman from before. This was something else, something larger. Its form was amorphous, constantly changing, its edges sharp and jagged like broken glass. The voice turned into a growl, guttural and inhuman. "Come home, Jamie." The staircase seemed to stretch downward, the steps multiplying endlessly as the glow intensified. Jamie's foot trembled as it touched the first step. The house exhaled, the sound reverberating through its walls. And then the door slammed shut behind them. The sound of the door slamming behind Jamie was deafening, a finality that sent a shiver straight to their bones. They had no choice but to move forward, the pull of the house too strong to resist. It was as if the very structure was alive, the stairs shifting and groaning beneath them as they descended into the darkness. The air grew heavier with each step, thick and damp, a stifling pressure that seemed to seep into Jamie's lungs, making it harder to breathe. The basement was not just a room beneath the house. It was a place that felt ancient, a place that had been waiting for them. Jamie's heartbeat drummed in their ears, the noise deafening in the quiet, broken only by the soft thud of their feet on the creaking stairs. They reached for the railing, but their hand passed through it as if the wood were made of smoke, dissolving as they touched it. They stumbled, the void beneath them seeming to stretch out endlessly. The glow from below pulsed as though it were calling to them, luring them closer. And beneath that glow, the shadow, large, ever-moving, shifted like a living thing waiting for them to reach the bottom. It was only when Jamie's foot landed on the final step that the full extent of the basement revealed itself. The walls were slick with a strange, black substance, glistening like oil. The air was thick with the smell of something rotten, something dead, and yet beneath it all, there was the faintest hint of something sweet, like old perfume mixed with decay. The room stretched far beyond what Jamie had expected. It was larger than the house above, as though the basement was not part of the house at all, but something else entirely. There were no windows here, no escape. The ceiling stretched upward into an abyss, and the shadows clung to every corner, like creatures waiting to emerge. Jamie's flashlight flickered, its beam bouncing around the cavernous room before landing on something in the farthest corner, a large, rusted chest. A low, guttural growl rumbled through the air, the sound seeming to come from all directions. The glow from the center of the room intensified, flickering like a dying flame, casting eerie shadows that danced along the walls. A voice, distorted and ragged, echoed through the room. "Jamie?" It was the same voice that had been calling them earlier, but now it was joined by others, whispers low and broken, like a chorus of tortured souls. They blended together, creating a maddening cacophony that rattled Jamie's mind. The chest creaked and Jamie's heart skipped a beat. It was moving, shifting as though something inside was pressing against the lid. Then, with a loud, reverberating snap, the chest opened. At first, Jamie saw nothing but darkness. But then, slowly, a figure began to take shape within the shadow. It was a man, but not. His body was contorted, twisted, his arms and legs bending at odd angles as though they were too long, too thin. His skin was pale, translucent, stretched tight over a skeletal frame. His eyes, if you could call them eyes, were hollow, dark pits that seemed to absorb the dim light, pulling everything into them. The figure lifted its head slowly, its mouth opening impossibly wide, a grin too large for any human face. Its voice was a hollow, raspy whisper, the words echoing inside Jamie's skull. "You came?" Jamie backed away, their mind racing. The words didn't make sense, but the meaning was clear. This thing, whatever it was, had been waiting for them. It had been calling them here, drawing them into the depths of the house, into this room where it could finally reveal itself. The air grew colder, the temperature dropping so fast that Jamie could see their breath mist in the air. Their skin prickled, a sense of dread filling every inch of their body. The whispers grew louder, merging into a single voice, echoing through the basement. "You belong to us now." The thing in the chest began to rise, its limbs twisting in unnatural directions as it unfolded itself, standing tall, towering over Jamie. The glow from the center of the room intensified, bathing the creature in light, and as it did, Jamie saw its face, a twisted mockery of their own. It smiled. And in that smile, Jamie saw everything. A vision exploded in their mind, the house, but not as it was now. It was pristine, beautiful, its walls shining white, its windows gleaming. In the vision, Jamie stood in the foyer, a little girl at their side, their mother smiling from the doorway. But then the vision shifted, the light flickering, distorting, and in the blink of an eye, the house twisted. The walls closed in, the windows darkened, and the smiles faded into expressions of terror. The little girl screamed, her face contorting into something grotesque, and then Jamie gasped, their body convulsing as the vision faded. The thing in front of them spoke again, its voice a low, guttural rasp. "It's time to remember." The room spun around them, and Jamie stumbled, clutching their head. The shadows that clung to the walls seemed to stretch toward them, reaching with long, twisted fingers. The whispers returned, louder now, more insistent. Jamie felt a tug in their chest, pulling them toward the center of the room. The glow from below was brighter now, suffocating. "No," Jamie whispered, shaking their head, trying to resist the pull. "I don't remember. I don't want to remember." But the tug intensified, a physical force, dragging them toward the center of the room, toward the creature. "You must." The chest, now fully open, seemed to grow larger, as though it were swallowing the room, swallowing Jamie. The ground beneath their feet trembled. The whispers grew into a shriek, a chorus of voices rising to a deafening crescendo. And then everything went dark. Jamie's eyes shot open, but the world around them was pitch black. They gasped, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and decay. Their heartbeat pounded in their ears, reverberating through their skull like a war drum. Panic gripped their chest as they tried to move, but their limbs felt heavy, sluggish, like they were submerged in thick water. The air was cold, freezing almost, and Jamie shivered involuntarily. They reached out with trembling hands, feeling nothing but the oppressive blackness surrounding them. There was no floor beneath them, no walls, no ceiling, just an empty void that stretched endlessly in all directions. The smell was stronger here, cloying, suffocating, as if the very air was saturated with death. Then a whisper broke the silence. "Jamie?" The voice was soft, familiar, but distorted. It came from somewhere close, yet far away, as though it was traveling through the very fabric of the darkness itself. Jamie's heart skipped a beat. The voice, they recognized it. It was their sister's. "Jamie, help me." The words were weak, broken. Desperation clung to them, and for a moment, the fog in Jamie's mind cleared. They couldn't breathe, couldn't think. Only one thing mattered, to find the source of that voice, to save their sister. The memory of her voice echoed in Jamie's mind, the same pleading tone from years ago, when she had vanished without a trace. Jamie pushed against the invisible walls of the void, trying to move, but the pressure was immense, like the weight of the world was pressing down on them, keeping them in place. They swallowed hard, their throat dry, and tried again. This time their feet found solid ground. The darkness around them didn't lift, but the sensation of pressure lessened. There was something beneath them now, some kind of floor, rough and uneven like stone. They could feel it through their shoes, a jagged texture that scraped against their soles. "Where are you?" Jamie's voice cracked as they called out. The sound seemed to vanish the moment it left their lips, swallowed by the oppressive air. The whisper came again, this time louder, clearer. "Jamie, you have to remember." "No," Jamie muttered, their voice hoarse with fear. "I don't want to remember." But the voice persisted. "You do. You have to. Before it's too late." Suddenly, the floor beneath Jamie gave way. The ground opened up like a wound, the jagged edges of stone pulling apart. Jamie's body jerked forward as they fell, tumbling through the darkness, their arms flailing in desperation. Their stomach lurched as the sensation of weightlessness took over, the air rushing past them, cold and biting. Just when it felt like they were about to be consumed by the abyss, the ground slammed into them with brutal force, knocking the breath from their lungs. They gasped, choking on the air, their body racked with pain. Slowly, painfully, Jamie pushed themselves upright, their hands scraped against rough stone as they tried to steady themselves. A dim, flickering light appeared in the distance. It was small at first, like the glint of a distant star, but it grew larger with each passing moment, until it filled the space in front of Jamie. It was a door. A wooden door, weathered and cracked, its surface scarred by years of neglect. The light pulsed from behind it, casting long shadows across the stone floor. Jamie could hear faint whispers, more urgent now, beckoning them forward. The voices were growing louder, filling the air with a maddening sense of dread. Jamie took a step toward the door. The closer they got, the more the voices seemed to intensify, as if something, or someone, was urging them to open it. With trembling hands, Jamie reached for the doorknob. It was cold, the metal slick under their fingers, but there was a sense of finality to it. As if once they opened this door, they would be crossing into something irreversible. Jamie hesitated, the words from the voices still ringing in their ears. You have to remember. Remember. What was it they needed to remember? What had they forgotten? The memories were there, just beyond their reach, like the echo of a dream slipping through their fingers. They turned the knob. The door creaked open slowly, revealing what lay beyond. The room beyond was not like the one Jamie had expected. It was familiar, yet utterly alien. The walls were covered in ancient, faded wallpaper, its patterns twisted and strange, as though the very designs were alive. The air in the room was thick with dust, the remnants of time and neglect. The floorboards creaked underfoot, and the faint scent of mildew lingered in the air. But what caught Jamie's attention wasn't the room itself. It was what lay in the center of the room. A table. On the table was a small, worn box. It was wooden, simple in design, but there was something about it that made Jamie's pulse quicken. The box was old, the wood darkened with age, its surface smooth and polished as though it had been handled countless times. And yet there was something unnerving about it, something that felt wrong. The whispers once again filled the air. They had grown louder, more urgent, like a storm building on the horizon. Open it. Jamie's hand moved involuntarily toward the box. Their fingers brushed against its surface, and an electric jolt shot through them, causing their muscles to tense. They froze for a moment, their heart hammering in their chest. But the voices urged them on. Open it. You have no choice. With a trembling breath, Jamie lifted the lid. The moment their fingers touched the edge, the room seemed to shift, the walls closing in on them. The floor began to shake, and the temperature plummeted, ice creeping up Jamie's spine. Inside the box was something small, wrapped in cloth. Jamie's pulse raced as they slowly, carefully unwrapped it. It was a photograph. Jamie stared at it in disbelief. The faces in the photograph were blurry, indistinct, but the image, the setting, the house. It was the Blackwood house, but it was different, brighter, newer. There was no decay, no shadow hanging over it. It was alive, warm. And standing in front of it was a family, a man, a woman, and 2 children. The figure of the woman, standing next to a little girl, caught Jamie's eye. The child was smiling, her eyes wide with innocence, but there was something off about her. Something Jamie couldn't quite place. The girl's face, it was too familiar. The room around Jamie seemed to tilt, warping and distorting as the memories flooded back. The faces in the photograph began to clear, becoming sharp and defined. The woman, the little girl. It was Jamie's family, but the memory felt wrong, twisted. And as the last pieces clicked into place, Jamie finally understood the truth. They weren't here by accident. This house, this place, wasn't just haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by the past. Their past. The air thickened, suffocating Jamie, and the whispers turned into screams. The room around them began to collapse, the walls closing in with an impossible speed. Jamie's heart raced as the door slammed shut behind them, trapping them in the suffocating dark. The creature's voice echoed in the void. You should never have opened the box, Jamie. The darkness took them. Jamie's mind reeled as they were pulled into the darkness, the weight of the creature's words crushing down on them. They tried to scream, but the air was thick, suffocating, and no sound escaped their lips. It was as though the very act of trying to resist had drained their voice, leaving them mute, their body paralyzed by an unseen force. But they could feel it, the overwhelming sensation of being watched, of something ancient and malicious hovering just beyond their sight. The temperature dropped further, so cold that Jamie's bones ached, and yet there was no sign of the cold source. No wind, no draft. Just the feeling that something was closing in. Suddenly, the blackness shifted. It was as though the shadows themselves were alive, writhing around Jamie, tightening, wrapping themselves around their limbs. Their chest constricted, every breath becoming more labored, more desperate. The walls seemed to press in on them from all sides, and they could feel the faintest pressure against their skin, like an unseen hand, cold and clammy, brushing against their face. Then, without warning, the weight lifted. Jamie collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air, their hands shaking as they pushed themselves up. The darkness remained, but now there was a faint light on the horizon, flickering, weak, but there. They stumbled forward, trying to find their footing, the sense of unease growing heavier with every step. The whispers were gone, replaced by a steady hum, like a distant drone of a broken radio. It felt like the sound was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, reverberating in Jamie's skull, drilling into their thoughts. The hum grew louder, more insistent, until it reached a deafening crescendo. The floor beneath Jamie's feet cracked. A sound like thunder shook the air, and the light ahead flickered violently before exploding into a blinding burst, blinding Jamie. They shielded their eyes with their arm, trying to focus on the source of the light. As their vision adjusted, they found themselves in a new place. A place that should have been familiar, yet felt entirely foreign. The Blackwood house stood before them, but it was not the crumbling ruin they had known. No, this was the house as it had once been. Pristine, vibrant, a family home full of life. The lawn stretched out before Jamie, a perfect carpet of green. The windows were spotless, the paint fresh and bright. It was a place that smelled of fresh air, of morning coffee, of happiness. But something was wrong. Jamie knew it. The hairs on the back of their necks stood up as they stepped forward, their breath catching in their throat. The house was the same, but it felt different, like a memory recalled but not quite accurate. There was a feeling of wrongness that permeated the air, like an invisible weight that hung over everything, waiting to collapse. As Jamie approached the door, it opened without a sound. There was no creaking, no resistance, just an eerie calm as the wooden frame swung inward, revealing the interior. Inside, the house was just as Jamie remembered, but it felt empty. The air was stale, as though the rooms had been untouched for years. There was no laughter, no voices calling from the kitchen. No warmth. Just silence. Jamie's feet moved of their own accord, carrying them deeper into the house. The wooden floors creaked beneath their weight, the sound echoing off the walls. The house felt alive, as though it were watching them, waiting for them to make a move. They entered the living room. The furniture was exactly as they remembered it. The old couch, the armchair by the window, the bookshelf crammed with old novels and trinkets. But again, there was no sign of life. No flicker of a TV, no humming of an air conditioner, nothing. The silence was oppressive. Then, from the corner of the room, something caught Jamie's eye. It was small at first, barely noticeable, but as they moved closer, they saw it clearly. A photo frame. It sat on the coffee table, the glass cracked but the image clear. In the photo, Jamie saw their family just as they had in the photograph from the box. But there was something different about this one, something unsettling. In this version of the picture, Jamie's mother and father stood side by side, smiling warmly. But beside them, standing a little farther back, was a little girl. The same girl from the photograph. The one with the haunting, familiar face. Jamie's heart raced as they picked up the frame. The girl was unmistakable now. Her hair, her smile, the way she stood with her hands clasped in front of her, as though she was waiting for something. But it was the eyes, those dark, empty eyes, that chilled Jamie to the core. Suddenly, the room felt colder, as though a shadow had swept through it, extinguishing the warmth. A low, rumbling sound filled the air, like the ground itself was groaning under the weight of some unseen force. The picture frame began to tremble in Jamie's hands, the glass vibrating as though it were about to shatter. Then, with a snap, the glass cracked wide open, and the photograph slipped from the frame, falling to the floor with a soft thud. Jamie's breath caught in their throat as they stared at the picture now scattered across the floor. In the moment before their mind could process it, the world shifted again. The house, once bright and full of life, began to decay before their eyes. The walls warped, the furniture began to rot, and the air grew thick with dust. The smell of mildew and decay overwhelmed Jamie's senses, and they staggered back, coughing as they tried to shield themselves from the suffocating atmosphere. A voice, low, distorted, echoed from the darkness. "You shouldn't have looked." Jamie turned toward the sound, heart pounding in their chest. The figure was standing in the doorway, the little girl from the picture, the one whose eyes seemed to swallow everything around her. But she was no longer smiling. Her face was twisted, a grotesque mask of pain and malice. Her eyes, those dark pits, stared into Jamie's soul as though she knew everything about them. Every fear, every regret, every unanswered question. "Now you'll never leave." The words sent a chill through Jamie's body. They stumbled backward, heart hammering in their chest. The walls seemed to close in, the air growing thick and suffocating. The girl stepped forward, her feet moving unnaturally, dragging her forward like a puppet on strings. The light from outside, the bright, welcoming sunlight, began to fade, consumed by an unnatural darkness that spread through the house. The warmth disappeared, replaced by an oppressive cold that seeped into Jamie's bones. They tried to move, but their feet were glued to the floor, as though some invisible force held them in place. And then, just as the darkness began to swallow them whole, the voice returned, louder this time, more insistent. "Remember, Jamie. You have to remember." Jamie screamed, but the sound was lost in the darkness. The girl's figure loomed closer, her mouth stretching open impossibly wide, and the last thing Jamie saw before the darkness consumed them was her smile. Jamie awoke to silence. At first they couldn't comprehend where they were. The ground beneath them felt soft, uneven, but warm. They were lying on their side, curled in a ball, breathing heavily. Their skin was clammy, drenched with sweat. The air around them was heavy, thick with the stench of mildew, damp wood, and decay. They tried to push themselves up, but their limbs were stiff as if they had been lying there for hours, days even. Slowly, they forced their body into a sitting position, their eyes squinting as they adjusted to the dim light. They were back in the Blackwood house, but not as it had been. Not as it had once been. The walls were warped, cracked, their surface splintering and peeling away like old paper. The floorboards groaned under the weight of their own decay, and the windows, once clear and inviting, were now covered in grime, blocking any trace of the outside world. The house seemed to be breathing, pulsing as though it were alive. A low hum filled the air, just like before, though it was quieter now. But the sound was deeper, more resonant. The whispers had returned, soft at first, barely audible, but growing louder with each passing second. Jamie could hear their names, whispers of family, of memories, but they couldn't make out the words. They felt like echoes of a life that had been ripped away from them, a life that felt too distant, too foreign to touch. "Jamie?" The voice came again. This time it wasn't the voice of their sister. It was deeper, older, and it had a cruel edge to it, as if the very word was a trap, a lure meant to pull Jamie deeper into the shadows. The voice swirled around them, twisting and contorting as it echoed off the warped walls. Jamie shivered involuntarily, the familiar sense of dread creeping back into their chest. They had to get out of here. They had to leave. But the house wasn't going to let them. The whispers became more urgent, like a chorus of voices calling from every corner of the room. "Remember?" The words sliced through Jamie's mind, jagged and sharp, making their temples throb. They pressed their palms to their ears, trying to block out the sound, but the voices only grew louder. "Remember what?" The question shot out of Jamie's mouth before they could stop it, the sound of their own voice the only anchor in the madness. The room seemed to pulse with the force of the words, the walls undulating as though they were breathing with a rhythm of their own. The air thickened again, and the cold grew unbearable, crawling under Jamie's skin. And then it happened. A figure stepped out of the shadows. It was the girl. The same girl from the photograph. But she was different. Her face was pale, too pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, those dark, empty eyes, seemed to be the only thing that was real in the entire room. The rest of her was a blur, as though her body was made of smoke, flickering in and out of existence. "You don't remember, do you, Jamie?" The girl's voice was distorted, a chorus of voices layered over one another, like hundreds of souls crying out in agony. Each word sent a shiver through Jamie's spine, shaking them to their core. Jamie shook their head, backing away, but their legs wouldn't move. It was as if the floor itself was holding them in place, binding them to the spot. Their hands reached out for something, anything, to hold onto, but the air was too thick and there was nothing to grasp. "You can't escape. You never could." The words hit Jamie like a physical blow, and for a moment they thought they might collapse. The house around them seemed to close in tighter, the walls pressing down, narrowing their world until it was just this single moment, this one truth. There was no way out. The girl took a slow, deliberate step forward, her face impossibly still. "Do you remember the family, Jamie? Do you remember your parents? Your sister?" The memories surged, unbidden, like a flood breaking through a dam. They remembered the house, not like this decayed shell, but as it had been when they were children. They remembered their sister's laughter, the way their parents' voices had been warm and comforting. They remembered the family dinners, the way the sunlight would pour through the windows in the evening, casting long shadows across the floor. But there were gaps, spaces in their memories. Dark spaces where things didn't quite fit, where they couldn't remember exactly what had happened. There was something wrong about the picture, something they hadn't noticed before. The girl's voice broke through the haze of memories. "They're gone, Jamie. They were always gone." Jamie's breath caught in their throat, and they looked up at the girl, their eyes wide with horror. What do you mean?" The girl's face twisted into something unrecognizable, something cruel, mocking. Her eyes narrowed, and a grin spread across her face, stretching impossibly wide, revealing rows of sharp, jagged teeth. "You never had a family, Jamie. Not like you think." The world seemed to freeze in that moment. The house, the girl, the whispers, they all faded into the background, leaving Jamie alone with the truth. The crushing weight of it. The horror of it. Jamie's body shook, their minds scrambling to make sense of what was happening, but the pieces didn't fit. They had memories, real memories, of their mother's voice, their father's laugh. They had lived in this house, hadn't they? They had a sister. But the girl in front of them, she had no right to speak like that. She wasn't real. She couldn't be. "It's too late to run, Jamie. The house has you now. You've always been here." The girl's form flickered, and Jamie's vision blurred, the room spinning wildly. They stumbled backward, their mind racing, trying to hold on to something, anything, just to keep from losing themselves completely. And then, with a sickening lurch, the house shifted again. This time, the walls didn't just move, they collapsed. The entire structure of the house seemed to crumble, as if the building itself was being swallowed by the earth. The floor beneath Jamie's feet shattered, falling away into the nothingness below. Screams echoed in the distance, distant, distorted, but unmistakable. The girl's figure vanished, leaving behind only a trail of blood-red light that flickered and twisted like a dying flame. The room around Jamie collapsed, folding in on itself until they were falling again, lost in the void. And the only thing left was the sound of their own voice, whispering one question over and over in the darkness. "Why? Why can't I remember?" Jamie's eyes snapped open. The fall had stopped. They were no longer plummeting into the void, no longer swallowed by the crumbling house. Instead, they found themselves lying on a cold stone floor, the air thick with dust and an overwhelming stench of rot. The remnants of the Blackwood house were gone, replaced by something much older, much darker. They took a shaky breath, the taste of must and decay thick on their tongue. A chill ran down their spine as they pushed themselves up, feeling the jagged stones beneath them. It was like waking up in a grave. The ground was uneven, covered in moss and tangled roots, the air damp and oppressive. And yet, there was something familiar about this place. Jamie's heart skipped a beat as their eyes adjusted to the gloom. It was a corridor. Long, narrow, stretching out in both directions like the hallway of an ancient cathedral or tomb. The walls were covered in creeping vines, their tendrils twisting and knotting together as if they were alive, feeding off the decaying stone. And at the far end of the hall, barely visible through the mist, was a door. A door. Jamie's mind raced as they tried to make sense of what was happening. Was this still the house? Was it another part of the house, some hidden room they had never seen before? The air felt different here, heavier, more suffocating. The echoes of distant whispers still lingered, but they were faint now, like the remnants of a dream that refused to let go. The door. It beckoned them. But the moment Jamie's gaze fell upon it, a cold, creeping fear wrapped around their heart. It was not just any door. It was an old wooden door, thick and dark, covered in symbols carved deeply into the wood. Symbols that looked ancient, unfamiliar, yet strangely familiar, as though they had seen them before but couldn't place where. Their jagged edges twisted and writhed in the dim light, creating an almost hypnotic effect. Jamie's throat tightened as they stood there, the desire to flee battling against the magnetic pull of the door. Every instinct screamed at them to turn away, to find another way out, but there was something compelling them forward. Something about that door, about the symbols, called to them, as if it held the answers to everything they had been trying to understand. "You have to open it." The whisper came from behind them, a cold breath against the back of their neck. Jamie spun around, but there was no one there. The corridor was still empty, save for the creeping vines and the oppressive darkness that seemed to stretch infinitely in both directions. But the voice, it had come from somewhere. Someone, or something, was here with them. The voice came again, louder this time, but still indistinct, like a distant echo bouncing off the walls. "It's the only way forward." Jamie's chest tightened, and they forced their feet to move, unable to resist the compulsion. The closer they got to the door, the more the air seemed to thicken. The walls around them seemed to pulse with an unsettling energy, like the heartbeat of some ancient creature that had been waiting for this moment. As they reached the door, their hand hovered over the rusted handle. It was cold to the touch, and when Jamie gripped it, they felt a jolt of electricity course through their fingers. It was like nothing they had ever felt before. Not just cold, but alive, as if the handle itself had a pulse, a life force that was now intertwined with theirs. A voice echoed in their mind, clearer now, like a chant, a command. Open it. Jamie's hand trembled, but they could not stop themselves. With a creak, the door groaned as they turned the handle and pushed it open, revealing the other side. What lay beyond was not what they had expected. Instead of the dark, decayed hallway they had assumed would follow, Jamie stepped into a vast, open space. The room was immense, stretching out endlessly in every direction. The air felt electric here, charged with an energy that hummed through Jamie's bones. The room itself seemed to shift, its boundaries undefined, like the walls could bend and twist at will, reshaping themselves to whatever the darkness desired. In the center of the room stood an altar, stone and cold, surrounded by flickering candles that cast strange, eerie shadows across the floor. The altar was adorned with symbols identical to the ones on the door, etched into its surface in blood-red paint. The blood seemed fresh, still wet, as though the ritual had just taken place. And standing before the altar, bathed in the dim candlelight, was a figure. Was the girl. But this time she was not flickering or ghostly. She was solid, her form corporeal, her eyes wide and unblinking, staring directly at Jamie. "Welcome back," the girl's voice echoed, cold and hollow. "I've been waiting for you." Jamie's breath caught in their throat. The words felt wrong, unnatural, and yet there was a strange familiarity to them, as though they had heard them before. Somewhere deep in the recesses of their mind, the truth clawed at them, but it remained just out of reach. The girl stepped toward them, her steps slow, deliberate, as though savoring the moment. "Do you remember now, Jamie?" she asked, her voice soft but chilling. "Do you remember who you really are?" Jamie tried to step back, but their body refused to move. They were rooted to the spot, trapped in place by an invisible force. The symbols on the altar seemed to shift, and with each movement, they felt the weight of the house pressing down on them. The girl's smile widened, her mouth stretching unnaturally wide, revealing rows of teeth, sharp and jagged like a predator's. "You were always meant to be here. You've always belonged to this place. And now you will never leave." A scream tore from Jamie's throat, but it was swallowed by the overwhelming presence of the room, the walls closing in, the symbols on the altar glowing brighter, pulsing with the rhythm of something alive. And then, just as the room seemed to collapse around them, Jamie saw it, the flicker of something behind the altar. A shadow, long and thin, slithering across the floor, moving with a life of its own. The figure in the shadow was not the girl. It was something far worse. Something ancient. Something that had been waiting for Jamie to finally remember. Jamie's pulse thundered in their ears, drowning out the unsettling silence that stretched between the flickering candles. Their breath came in ragged gasps, each inhale laced with fear and the crushing weight of something dark closing in around them. The figure in the shadow, it was no longer a vague silhouette. It was taking form, materializing in a grotesque, fluid motion, as though it were being pulled from the very fabric of the room itself. The air around Jamie seemed to thicken, pressing in, suffocating them with its oppressive presence. The girl smiled wider, if it could even be called a smile, her lips parting to reveal the gaping void within her mouth. The look in her eyes, once hollow and empty, now glowed with an unsettling hunger. Her gaze never left Jamie, the intensity of it sending chills down their spine, paralyzing them where they stood. "Do you see it now?" the girl asked, her voice a low, almost playful whisper. "Do you see what's been waiting for you?" The shadow loomed larger, its movements growing more frantic, like a beast trying to escape a cage. It crawled toward Jamie, its form now indistinct and ever-changing, elongated limbs, jagged edges, and a face that flickered in and out of clarity, always shifting, always changing. It was a thing of nightmares, a manifestation of every horror Jamie had ever feared. Jamie's mind raced, trying to make sense of it all, but the more they tried to focus, the more the world seemed to bend and warp, as if their very thoughts were being twisted by some unseen force. The house, the real house, was fading, slipping through their fingers like sand. Nothing made sense anymore. It felt like they were caught in some terrible dream, one that they couldn't wake up from. "No, this isn't real," Jamie gasped, the words a desperate plea, more for themselves than for the girl. They tried to step back again, but their feet felt glued to the floor, their body refusing to obey. The girl tilted her head as though considering Jamie's words. Her eyes gleamed, too wide, too sharp. "Not real? No, you're wrong." Her voice was thick with malice, and her smile faltered for a brief moment, as though the act was beginning to strain her. "You were never meant to leave, Jamie. The door wasn't meant for you to escape. It was meant to bring you back. Back to where you belong. Jamie's heart pounded, their chest constricting with the weight of those words. Back to where you belong, the phrase echoed in their mind, and something deep within them twisted with recognition. The shadow moved again, its pace quickening, the air around it crackling with a sickening energy. It was alive, a creature that shouldn't exist, and yet it was here in front of them, its eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Jamie's skin crawled and a cold sweat broke out across their forehead. "What do you want from me?" They croaked, the words barely a whisper. The girl's smile was the last thing they saw before everything shifted. Without warning, the ground beneath Jamie's feet gave way, and they were falling again. This time there was no soft landing. There was no waking up in some different room or strange corridor. They fell endlessly, the world around them stretching and distorting as they plummeted through the void, the darkness closing in on all sides. The whispering voices returned, louder now, surrounding them, pulling at their sanity. Jamie couldn't make out the words, but they could feel the weight of them, suffocating, pressing against their mind. There was a dull, gnawing pain behind their eyes, and they could taste the metallic tang of blood on the back of their throat. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the fall stopped. Jamie hit the ground with a harsh thud, the impact knocking the breath out of them. They lay there for a moment, gasping for air, the coldness of the stone floor seeping through their clothes. When they opened their eyes, they found themselves in another room. But this one was different. The air was thick with the scent of incense and something bitter, something they couldn't place. The walls were lined with shelves of old books, their leather spines cracked and yellowed with age. Strange, ancient artifacts sat in glass cases, their contents long forgotten by time. The room was dimly lit by flickering candles, their flames dancing like the last remnants of a dying fire. It was a library, or at least that's what it looked like. But there was something wrong with it. Something wrong with the way the books seemed to shift when Jamie's gaze flicked over them, as though the words were alive, changing before their eyes. The air was heavy with a sense of foreboding, as if the room itself were watching them, waiting for something. Jamie forced themselves to sit up, their body trembling. The cold stone beneath them offered no comfort. There was no escape from this place, no way out. Their mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Where was the girl? Where had the shadow gone? Was it still out there, lurking in the corners of their mind, waiting for them to let their guard down? As they stood shakily, their eyes caught on a large book resting on a pedestal in the center of the room. Its cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age. The symbols etched into the cover were familiar, too familiar. They were the same symbols that had been on the door, the same ones on the altar. The same ones that had haunted Jamie since the moment they stepped into this house. The book called to them. For a moment they hesitated, their instincts screaming at them to turn away, to run, but they couldn't. The pull was too strong. With trembling hands, Jamie reached out and opened the book. The pages were filled with dark, twisted drawings. Symbols, creatures, and scenes of madness, each one more disturbing than the last. The ink seemed to pulse on the page as though the drawings were alive, watching them. But it was the words that caught Jamie's attention. They were written in a language they didn't recognize, but somehow they understood. "You are not the first to enter this place, nor will you be the last." The words burned into Jamie's mind like a brand, searing their very soul. A sudden realization washed over them, an understanding so profound, so horrifying, that it left them gasping for breath. "You were always meant to be here. You were always meant to open the door." Jamie slammed the book shut, but the words lingered in their mind, echoing like a curse. They had been drawn here, led here by something older than time itself. The house wasn't trying to trap them. It was trying to bring them home. And now Jamie had no choice but to face the truth. They had never left, and they never would. Jamie's heartbeat thundered in their chest, the pulse reverberating in their ears like a drumbeat, drowning out the haunting whispers that continued to gnaw at their sanity. The room, the library, felt colder now, colder than it had before. The flickering candlelight cast long, twisting shadows across the walls, their shapes morphing into grotesque forms, as though the very darkness in the room were alive, feeding off their fear. Their hands shook as they held the closed book, the weight of its presence too much to bear. The symbols on its cover seemed to burn through the leather, as if they had been branded there by something beyond human comprehension. There was no mistaking it anymore. This was the heart of the house, the epicenter of the dark power that had been stalking Jamie since the moment they first stepped through its doors. But the truth, the terrible truth, was that the house wasn't the monster. It wasn't even the girl. The true horror lay deeper, hidden in the pages of this cursed book. The answers, if they were ready to face them, were written in the ancient script that swirled before Jamie's eyes, its words clawing at their soul. The shadows seemed to inch closer, coiling around Jamie's legs like serpents, tightening with each breath they took. The room pulsed with a life of its own, the walls creaking and groaning as though the very foundations were shifting beneath them. Something was coming. Something was waking up. "You were always meant to be here," the voice echoed in Jamie's mind, and this time, it wasn't the girl. It wasn't even the shadow. It was something older, something more insidious, its voice reverberating through the room like the sound of nails scraping across a blackboard. "You belong here, Jamie. You always have." Jamie stumbled back, the book still clutched in their hands. Their legs buckled beneath them, but they managed to steady themselves against a nearby shelf. The room felt as though it was closing in on them, the walls creeping inward, the air growing thick and suffocating. "No, no," Jamie whispered, shaking their head, their voice a tremulous echo in the silence. "I don't belong here. I can't, asterisk asterisk." But the words didn't help. They didn't change the reality of what Jamie now understood. The truth, as terrible as it was undeniable. They weren't a victim of circumstance. They weren't trapped in some twisted game. No, this had always been their fate. The door, the altar, the house itself. They had all been leading Jamie to this moment, and now that they had opened the book, there was no going back. The sound of scratching, of something dragging across the floor, echoed through the room. Jamie's eyes snapped toward the door, but it wasn't the door that caught their attention. It was the shadow creeping along the floor, slithering toward them like an insect on the hunt. It was moving faster now, its form beginning to take shape again, growing more defined. "No," Jamie said again, more forcefully this time. "I won't be part of this." But the words were hollow, meaningless. The truth had already been planted in their mind, a seed that was now growing roots, digging deeper, taking hold. The girl's words, the ones from before, they had been a warning about who Jamie truly was. The shadow had taken on form, its limbs twisted and elongated, its eyes black holes that seemed to swallow light. And standing beside it, like a dark queen beside her monstrous king, was the girl. Her smile had twisted into something far more grotesque, her mouth stretching too wide, her teeth sharp and pointed, gleaming in the dim candlelight. Jamie's body was frozen, their muscles locking in place, unable to move. The shadow and the girl were the same, two halves of a whole, bound together by something ancient, something unforgiving. And in that moment, Jamie understood. This wasn't the first time they had been here. Jamie had been here before, long ago, in another life, in another form. They had forgotten. They had run from it, but they had always returned. And now they were back. They were back because the house had called them, because it had never let them go. "You've forgotten us, haven't you?" The girl's voice was a whisper now, but it seemed to fill the entire room, vibrating through Jamie's very bones. "You've forgotten who you are. But you'll remember soon enough." The words reverberated through Jamie's skull, and the darkness seemed to swell around them, thickening like smoke. They could feel it now, the pull of the house, the pull of the shadow, the pull of the girl. The door had been the beginning, but this was the end. The altar began to glow, faint at first, then brighter, its light so intense it hurt to look at. The book in Jamie's hands seemed to hum, as if it were alive, responding to the ritual that was beginning around them. The symbols on its pages flared to life, and Jamie saw them clearly now, each one representing a piece of the house's twisted history, each one representing a soul, a prisoner who had been bound to this place for eternity. "You will join us, Jamie," the shadow spoke, its voice a low growl, a guttural sound that reverberated through Jamie's chest. "You will be part of us, part of the house." Jamie's body trembled, their minds splintering under the weight of the revelation. The truth was too much to bear, too vast to comprehend. But as they stood there, unable to move, unable to escape, a single thought pierced through the chaos. The house was alive. The girl, the shadow, they were part of it, manifestations of its power, its hunger. And Jamie, whether they wanted it or not, was connected to it, bound to it, always had been. The altar's light flared one final time, and Jamie's body lurched forward, as if drawn by an invisible force. The book in their hands burned like fire, searing their skin, but they couldn't let go. The power coursing through them was overwhelming, blinding, and in the brief moment before it consumed them entirely, Jamie saw the truth in the final pages of the book. The door was never meant to set them free. It was meant to bring them back. And as the darkness closed in, Jamie understood. They had never truly escaped. They had always been meant to return. And now there was no way out.